Okay, we're ready to go.
All right.
All right, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. I think we're all in the same time zone. So thank you for carving out some time to share your research, to learn from each other, and to build this scholarly practice together with the Shade Research Collective. I'm immensely grateful for everyone's participation, and this is the culmination, really, of kind of effort to bring some more focus and collaboration across our research projects. To our audience, thank you for tuning in on a Saturday morning. And what looks like today is going to be a beautiful day. So after this, I hope everyone gets outside. I'm certainly going to need that. So before we get too far along, I wanted to acknowledge that we here in Connecticut are living on the indigenous territories of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape people's land. And that the European settlers that occupied this land by force and enriched themselves through the enslavement of their indigenous neighbors and the importation and traffic of enslaved Africans. And it's upon this foundation which we engage the work of the research collective. Okay. So with this, this project could not have come to fruition without my collaborator, Fiona Vernal, also professor of history at the University of Connecticut. She has been a mentor and a colleague and a guide into this work for me. So it's the immense pleasure that I get to share this this project with Fiona as we co-pilot this this collective, and it was our efforts to bring this together to get funding from the New England Humanities Consortium to make this collaboration possible. We also have had help from the UConn's Humanities Institute, as well as the Africana Studies Institute and the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. And so we're immensely grateful for all of that work. I want to thank in advance all the presenters for waking up and being prepared for intellectual engagement this early in the morning. I also want to thank the members of the collective who couldn't make it, but some who are in attendance, like Ariel Lamb and Emma Amador and Jarell Melendez Badillo, and other folks who have worked behind the scenes to produce some analysis, to do work for the collective, James Kolb and Erica Bella and Sulema de Pester. So a lot of people have been have helped make this possible. Very, very grateful. So if anyone would like to, anyone who doesn't already know would like to check out the collective, there's a website. And let me drop that link here in the chat. So the collective is, well, let me start here. The structure for today is going to be two panels with 3 presentations each. We're going to run the presentations about 15 to 20 minutes each, saving us some time for Q&A. We're going to take a little bio break in the middle, and then we will hear from the following panel. I will introduce this panel. So I'm going to go first. And I don't know that I've even introduced myself yet. So maybe I should do that. So my name is Jason Chang, and I'm professor of history and Asian American studies at University of Connecticut. My presentation is entitled Imperial Frames and Colonial Politics in the Making of the Tobacco Valley. Next, we'll have a presentation from Professor Fiona Vernal, The Long Shadow and Legacies of World War II Labor Programs. And then we're going to hear from Elena Rosario, Puerto Rican tobacco worker migration to Connecticut. And which I believe the title might be different. So I apologize if I messed that up. And then I'm gonna let Fiona introduce the second panel afterwards. So before I get started, are there any questions about the program for today? No? Okay. All right, great. Well, I'm gonna get started then. I'm gonna put myself on a timer. And in that way, I will know when to wrap it up. So if you'll give me a moment here to get my screen up, and I will be ready to go. Okay. How's that look, everyone? Is that the, are you seeing the presentation or the presenter view?
The presenter view, it looks like.
Oh, okay. Didn't want to do that. I think I want to do that. And then okay, I think that's the one. Does that look right?
Looks good, yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, apologies for that. Okay, so my presentation today is Imperial Frames and Colonial Politics in the Making of the Tobacco Valley. This represents current research that I've done in the last couple of months here in Connecticut, researching several archives in the valley. This represents a preliminary research that that tries to examine the imperial origins of the shade industry, shade-grown tobacco industry, and examine the cultural politics of sustaining what I'm calling an internal colony of tobacco cultivation. So one of the things that I've done to start off is to reflect on Fernando Ortiz's original kind of contemplation of the character of tobacco in his book, Cuban Counterpoint. And in that, he describes an analysis of sugar, the cultivation of sugar and tobacco under the colonial conditions of Cuba, and produces a kind of a theory that he called transculturation, which is really the economic, political, and cultural systems that emerged from colonial and imperial processes of agricultural commodity production. And the transition from one, from sugar to another, tobacco, involved intercultural contact and often on uneven terms. And so I really, wanted to lean into the theoretical kind of and the methodological work that Fernando Ortiz spelled out almost 100 years ago, because the idea of kind of thinking through an analysis which proceeds from the history of the material conditions or requirements for a certain mode of production, then allows us to proceed to the conditions of possibility established by U.S. empire, and then provides a foundation to comprehend the cultural politics which sustained that practice. And so it's with this in mind that I move forward and structure the analysis of tobacco cultivation in the state. So one of the things I do is I reflected on an 1873 state agricultural board conversation in Hartford, which defined the problem of growing the agricultural industry in the state as a problem, in which the farmers were the primary problem, that they did not grow crops that could be marketed abroad, and that they were resistant to changing their practices or trying new things. And it is at this point that that the state began to consider the value of agricultural experimentation. And this led to an understanding of marketable products and what kinds of agricultural practices were needed for the state's farmers to enter into global commodity circuits. And so with that, experimentation included other things like the preparation of agricultural commodities, not only how to grow them, but how to harvest them, how to cure them, or prepare them for market and to trade them. All of those things had to be invented in order for the Agricultural Review Board of the late 19th century to consider how to build the agricultural industry of the state. And so I've included the data from two sources which produced this decennial statistic of the acres of tobacco harvested in Connecticut from 1871 to 1991. And I haven't checked these numbers against others, so I'm not 100% confident in these numbers, but they do provide a really stark kind of picture for how the tobacco industry has grown and subsided. The main touch points I'm going to emphasize on are the turn of the century here, where we see the increased growth of tobacco, and then also the decline in the 40s and 50s, with an eye to this the lower portion of this graph here, which identifies the declination of tobacco, but yet a sustained presence in the state. So this image here is taken from a booster pamphlet from 1958 by the Shade Tobacco Growers Association, and it states here it was about that time. This is around the turn of the century, that Uncle Sam stepped into the picture. By joining forces with nature and Connecticut farmers, our government began tests in an effort to find ways and means of producing by scientific method a Sumatra type in American fields. So this is you know, of course, an image depicting state support for agricultural experimentation, and this is an important kind of characterization of how the industry emerged, because it was really through the help of the extension offices and agricultural scientists at UConn and at other places in the state to develop new ways of growing crops. And you know, in reflection with Fernando Ortiz's work and his description of the monopoly of Cuban tobacco, is that it was a unique crop that could only grow in Cuba. And so there was a market advantage for these Caribbean tobacco growers. And Ortiz stated that, you know, Cuba's greatest protection from trade competition was the environmental conditions which supported the cultivation of prized species for cigars. But it was the agricultural extension and experimentation labs that were vital to testing the feasibility of growing these Caribbean and Southeast Asian varieties of tobacco. And that this market and the product existed, you know, outside of Connecticut before the existence of the social system needed to support that industry. And so, you know, trade advantages gave promise to an agricultural experimentation that didn't have an existing, you know, labor structure to support it. And so this image here is from the first successful shade-grown crop from the agricultural experimentation station in New Haven, Connecticut. And this really marks a triumph by agricultural scientists to reproduce the ecological conditions of the Caribbean and Southeast Asia in Connecticut. And that by doing so, they consciously sought to reproduce the plantation of the colony within the state, and that this was and by doing so could leverage the imperial trade powers of the state to gain market advantage in a space where they previously didn't have that power. So here we have a map of tobacco growing regions produced in 1907, and this, you know, kind of demonstrates some of the major areas which were producing and trading tobacco on the global market. And in particular, I want to highlight here that with the Spanish-American War and the U.S. Philippine War of Occupation at the turn of the century, this was a major military operation that turned into territorial occupation, and also which ignited the interests of U.S. tobacco companies that saw this as a means for gaining a foothold in another tobacco market. So more on that in a second. Also, the Caribbean became another player in this. As we can see from the map, the Caribbean produced a lot of tobacco, and primarily Cuba, but all of the islands produced some tobacco. And here we have also during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. Gains occupation of Puerto Rico, and so here we have a depiction of Puerto Rico as being shackled by trade restrictions on sugar and tobacco here. So again, we see that through the imperial politics of the state, that markets were found for these products. In this one here, we see. Let me catch up here. This image here depicts the success of U.S. agricultural interests in preserving tariff exemptions and therefore price advantage on the world market. And this here represents, this is, if you can't read it, this is the Philippines, which is clothed in the U.S. flag, resting on a block that says corporate greed here. So this is the imperial framing that I've discovered in trying to understand how how shade-grown tobacco emerged in Connecticut. And remember that the growth of the acreage, this is really the turning point, the conditions of possibility for that expansion. So with these imperial conditions, or following Ortiz, we need to ask, what are the cultural expressions which sustained this new plantation system designed to replicate the colony? And with the, one of the things that defines the character of tobacco is that in order to preserve the leaf, the tobacco leaf requires a lot of human care, both in the cultivation, but then in the curing, preservation, wrapping, and so it requires a lot of skilled hand labor. But this is happening in a context where there isn't already an existing, the labor relationships did not exist prior to the invention of this crop in Connecticut. So one of the things that that emerges out of this are new cultural forms that rationalize the kinds of labor bottlenecks and the disposability of labor for that system. And that system is then also defined by its whiteness and the choices it makes about describing itself and portraying itself in the public. And so I'm going to cover three frames that I've found in the archives that kind of sustain this image of the plantation in Connecticut. So just a couple minutes left. So this will be a quick flyby. But here we see, that playing Indian was important to the cultural production of and sustaining the industry, from the Cigar Tobacco Harvest Festival 1950s to Ladsbury here playing Indian, mockingly putting a cigar into a peace pipe and smoking it that way. And then also naming the cigar products and leaves after indigenous names here. Second is sexism, and this became very apparent in the way that temporary workers, say like college students, white female college students from Florida who came to Connecticut to work in fields and then participated in ad campaigns that described it as vacation work, to beauty pageants, and ultimately selling tobacco through sexism. We can see that clearly with this cartoon here, which describes the Tobacco Valley festival and the selection of a Tobacco Valley queen. So there's this idea that there is a great looking cigar that corresponds with great looking women that are then celebrated, and then men can smoke the great looking cigar and think about these great looking women. Second is paternalism, and we can see this in several different ways, from the United Negro College Fund advertisements to the pedantic treatment of Puerto Rican workers, and then also just the characterization of youth as benefiting from agricultural labor. But then we also see that that this turns into silence in the 80s with tobacco litigation. So no longer is there a public campaign to sustain tobacco, but there is increasing, increasingly tobacco is seen as a killer, as proposing health, presenting enormous health risks. Nevertheless, the industry persists, and in that silence, new workers emerged in that industry that also became invisible. And here's an image of Laotian workers who began working in the 1980s as they were entering the U.S. as refugees. So these are all preliminary kinds of research that kind of characterizes the it's kind of a test or an experiment of this method of looking at the Tobacco Valley. And I really appreciate any feedback or any thoughts that folks have on this, and really looking forward to the conversation and seeing the other research from the collective. So I think with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it over to Fiona.
Thank you, Jason. Just share my screen. Is my screen share successful?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Fiona Vernal, History and Africana Studies. To the list of thank yous, I'd also like to add the History Department, the Sandra Rux Funds, the Office of Undergraduate Research for providing us with interns and defraying the costs of that through the work study program, to Greenhouse Studios, the Office of the Dean, the Geography Department, and Urban and Community Studies, all of which have provided funds in one form or the other to help support this overall project alongside those Jason thanked. My presentation today focuses on the long shadow and legacies of World War II labor coalitions that came together to provide temporary foreign workers to the agricultural industry. I think, like in many other presentations, I might have been overly ambitious in some of the things that I want to cover. So please bear with me as I try to get through my slides. Probably the most important thing for me is I found a quote about God. So I want to make sure that I get through that. All right. The introduction of temporary foreign agricultural workers eased manpower shortages during World War II and transformed the bargaining power of small New England states, shown here, through agricultural guest worker programs. These programs drew on Mexican, West Indian, and Canadian workers, about whom there very little has been written, and there's, for any budding Canadian historians, this would be a great topic. So if anybody's listening right now, please join our collective, because we need someone to work on the French Canadian piece. So British, Mexican, West Indian, and Canadian workers, growers made a compelling case for the role of food security and cash crop production in the overall war effort. This involved bilateral labor agreements between British West Indian colonies, as well as the Mexican government and the United States, and that ended up specifically for the British West Indian colonies. I may refer to them subsequently as BWI. This ended up distributing agricultural labor to about 24 states, with figures ranging anywhere from 8,000 in 1943 to almost 21,000 in 1945. Excuse me. These migrations ended up easing labor tensions in the Caribbean against a kind of rhetoric that was floating around, that the Caribbean was a site of squalor, poverty, as well as hunger, and that these war-related manpower shortages would bring new economic opportunities for Caribbean folks to work in the agricultural industry, whether that means cutting sugarcane in Florida and picking apples in Midwestern states, for example. Interestingly, these images are not actually coming from the boosters, but rather from anti-colonial activists who actually want to indict the British government for the squalor, poverty, and hunger that they said was found in the Caribbean. So these migrations importantly eased labor tensions in the Caribbean. Here we have a picture of the Jamaica Daily Gleaner in 1938, showing that 1,000 laborers had walked out of agricultural estates there. This kind of headline scared shade tobacco growers and other agricultural corporations, because the militancy that West Indian workers showed was certainly not something that they wanted reflected in the pool of laborers that they brought to the U.S. And as Jason has shown, in Connecticut specifically, the shade tobacco industry was able to absorb thousands of workers who planted tobacco, netted it, and harvested it. In subsequent decades, after other states had rolled back their use of West Indian laborers, shade tobacco growers staked a particular claim to the West Indian guest worker program and teamed up with apple and sugar corporations to ensure access to labor after the war was over. In contrast to this particular headline, which clearly shows labor militancy, they were keen on emphasizing that the workers are pliable and docile, which is sort of an interesting way to describe West Indian laborers, as well as, and that the program would enclose, and that was the word they chose, enclose folks for the duration of their stay in the United States, and that the workers who infringed on any of the labor contract would be deportable. And so one of the goals of this research collective is to underscore the role that shade tobacco growers in particular played in leveraging wartime labor agreements into a permanent post-war policy, and in building coalitions in the Midwest especially. And then with growers in Florida, especially the sugar, the sugar corporations, to maintain this labor program. The other side of the research, of course, can interrogate really important questions about the agency and bargaining position of West Indian workers and the friable and sometimes really paternalistic relations that emerge in the post-World War II era. That is a completely different chapter of this project that I am also working on. The 1917 Immigration Act banned the recruitment of foreign labor, but it left important loopholes for the recruitment of labor that had special skills, and gave the AG, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Labor, discretion on when they should admit inadmissible aliens under temporary conditions, provided, of course, that the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is now ICE, provided a waiver. And so you can already see the ways in which various segments of the federal government come to play a really outsized role in what this program and other guest worker programs could look like. This also includes the U.S. Farm Security Administration, which is a 1937 New Deal agency that succeeded another agency. This one focused on aiding farmers and addressing rural poverty and employment, as well as the U.S. Employment Services, which was created in 1933 as well to help folks who were unemployed and jobless be part of a more coordinated system, and with the help of the federal and state governments for them to all collaborate to make sure that the growers had the laborers at the time that they need them, and that the needs of the laborers were being addressed. There was tremendous pushback on just how much the federal government was involved in these programs, and the growers were quite wary about losing their autonomy to the federal government. So by the time temporary labor is permitted in 1942, guest worker programs had surmounted a great political challenge from a range of national politicians who could not be convinced that the program was necessary, given how poor and destitute domestic labor was. And they saw instead that the agricultural industry had an overabundance of labor, and were concerned that the agricultural industry also had no ability to compel workers to go back home, and that they had no interest in implementing any program that didn't include the ability to deport workers. Despite the poverty, insecurity, and abuse experienced by domestic agricultural workers, most growers continued to work to undercut their bargaining positions. Black workers in particular were variously described as loafers, gamblers, drinkers, and perhaps worst of all, were able to strike, sit out for higher wages, or generally try to exercise the minimal of rights. The real needs of the real manpower needs of World War II short-circuited this argument temporarily, and those who worked in the background to get temporary authorization were finally able to secure Mexican and West Indian workers. There are tons of images in the Farm Security Administration records, which is available in Yale's Photogrammer DH project. Once these agreements were made, they had the power to deport, to enclose, to survey, to blacklist those who wanted to go back home early, anybody who refused to work, try to engage in collective bargaining. All of the punitive assurances that critics needed to getting the labor programs enacted were indeed enacted. And so approximately 4,200 Mexicans arrived in 1942. This number would grow to 52,000 in 1943. These numbers especially of Mexican workers continued to increase into the 1940s. Specifically for the Northeast, we have Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut becoming particular beneficiaries, but they also packed off West Indians to 21 other states, including California, Florida, New York, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and Michigan. After World War II came to an end, the political battles over the needs of, over whether the program was still needed started again. Eventually, they won this debate and the programs were incorporated into the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act. And thereafter, anywhere from 200,000 to 450,000 workers were coming in, with the lion's share of that being Mexican bracero workers. As Jason has pointed out, shade tobacco supplanted broadleaf to become dominant in the Connecticut River Valley. Folks were concerned about things that probably nobody in this audience cares about: the aroma, texture, the burn, the size of that leaf. And there were always labor bottlenecks, as Jason has just pointed out. And the growers got together and used any kind of labor. So this sort of medley of images show youth laborers, West Indian laborers, and Southeast European laborers. Mr. Ralph Lasbury of the Peace Pipe fame. Here's West Indian workers, Windsor, Connecticut in 1950s, courtesy of the Windsor Historical Society. So Mr. Lasbury was hired as the executive director of the Growers Association in 1942 and played a pivotal role in what the Shade Tobacco Growers Association would look like in the subsequent decades. But between 1942 and 1950, growers were able to get, after the war up to 1950, growers were able to get extensions. But after April 30th, 1950, workers were no longer permitted because of the increased unemployment and the end of World War II. Despite these pleadings of the Growers Association that they still needed West Indian workers, the Department of Labor said, we may as well all understand at the beginning that foreign labor is not in any sense to be permitted to displace qualified and available domestic labor, and the full and bona fide cooperation of each user in accomplishing this will be insisted upon. And in helping to support that argument, there were just sort of a tremendous amount of launching of concerns about white poverty and of whites being also in poverty, squalor, and hunger. And that this needed to be addressed before more foreign workers were brought. The shade tobacco growers were able to bring a huge number of workers across all of these states. I've highlighted Connecticut in blue. And what's most important about this number for Connecticut is that Connecticut hovers between 1,000 and 2,600 workers. And long after these other figures fall off, Connecticut continues to depend on these workers. And so in 1951, the next step to shoring up this program is to create a British West Indian Employers Committee. And there was lots of debate about what to call it, if they should call it a corporation. And eventually the organization decided that, quote, the word of corporation would be anathema to a lot of these new dealers. And so the word association was selected. Jason, can you time me? I've lost track of my time now. Thanks. This coalition united a motley crew of growers in these states in particular. And and this, I call it a cabal, or maybe it's a cooperative, but this cabal is central in representing the needs, especially of small scale farmers who believed it wasn't economical for them to compete for Mexican laborers, and that the Southwest growers were so chaotic and disorganized in the way that they conducted their labor policies that the the shade tobacco growers did not think that they could sort of enter into agreements that mirrored what was going on in the Southwest. They also had some conspiracy theories where they thought that those who were pushing for Mexican labor were deliberately conspiring to make sure that the British West Indian, those who are using British West Indian workers were at each other's throats. The program continues after the 1950s, and so Lasbury is very, very successful, but he remained on edge for a really long time to see if the Mexican program was going to undermine his. And you know, in his private comment, there's so much sort of sarcasm and joking about a different cabal, about the cabal of government and organized labor, and that whenever there were commissions to investigate the program, they were always staged for the benefit of organized labor, tight government controls, social security, unemployment compensation, and minimum wages. Luckily for the growers, the Korean War renewed fears about labor shortages, and so that ended up boosting the program. But always in the background was sort of this ongoing concern about the impact on domestic labor. In fact, the average annual income of British West Indian workers in the program was $3,000 in 1961, whereas the average annual income of US migrant farm labor was $1,000. And there was a lot of blame for temporary guest worker programs for the sorry state of domestic labor. The Growers Association pushed back and said, in fact, so many of the provisions that around sick pay, housing, food, rations, guaranteed minimum work, so many of the things that were in the provisions that were enshrined in the guest worker programs had actually served as fodder to help the domestic agricultural laborers. The vast majority of historians do not agree with this assessment. As this is going on, there is a lot of bad press about the Bracero program, and the shade tobacco growers are concerned that if the Bracero program comes to an end, and it does, there's like mass deportation of Mexican workers, that this would actually harm everyone who wanted to use foreign agricultural workers. They also complained that the West Indian labor liaisons had way too much power, and that it was their fault that West Indian workers got higher wages and better conditions and a really good inspection system. The West Indian Central Labor Organization, which is the negotiating arm, was described as a, quote, playhouse of personal patronage among the liaisons. And one particular thing that incised them was always meeting in Jamaica. The British West Indian Central Labor Organization always wanting to meet in Jamaica. And I think I found the most hilarious quote I think I've ever found in my research, which says that meeting in Jamaica gives the Central Labor Organization the tactical advantage because they know that these like white people want to go home, and they also know that a lot of growers are there and they need to like oversee what's going on in Congress and all of the debates and keep up with what's going on with the Bracero program as there's controversies and all kinds of problems with the program. and the growers were told when the West Indians, quote, hemmed and hawed, the growers were eventually told, "We are dealing with God, and God cannot move to the meeting place of his disciples," which I think is the most hilarious thing. Mexico continued to trouble them. And it led to another quote where pretty much the shade tobacco growers were complaining that Mexico just had this outsized place and influence in the United States, and that the State Department would pander to them all the time. And the State Department tells you, we need their oil, we need this in case of war, this being their labor. We give them everything they want. And the shade tobacco growers are having a conversation among themselves about how the US is always pandering to Mexico, which is a really interesting account of the Bracero program. To counter debates about dealing with each island and sort of the group of central labor organizations that's negotiating on behalf of West Indians, Lasbury eventually assured everyone that he could totally cut a side deal with Jamaica, because like the Jamaicans would sell all the other West Indians out, and just the physical proximity of Jamaica just actually gave Jamaica more bargaining positions. And they had performed so well as docile labor during World War II that the U.S. government was more than happy to negotiate. To negotiate with them. Let me conclude in the next 2 minutes so that I don't go over time if I haven't gone over time already. Taken from the perspective of the Shade Tobacco Growers Association, the legacies and coalitions of the World War II era does cast a really long shadow over guest worker programs in a way that Cindy Hamovich is probably the person who's writing about this most informs my thinking. And while there is a significant, her book is one of the only standalone books about Jamaican workers as opposed to Caribbean workers or the entire, West Indies. It doesn't include the Lasbury collection, and the Lasbury collection really gives you a specific angle on how central Windsor is, on how central the Shade Tobacco Growers Association is, and gives us a different angle on what is happening with small scale farmers who need 5 workers, 20 workers, 200 workers, as opposed to the hundreds of workers that would end up going to pick apple in upstate New York, or the hundreds of workers who would be cutting sugarcane in Florida. And I think this is a really important part of the equation for making new interventions about the importance of guest worker programs. And I think a lot of historians have missed it because of the relatively small scale. But Lasbury is in Jamaica all the time. And I think there's something to be done in terms of writing a great article about him as well. The last thing that I wanted to say is the British West Indian program enshrined itself in the debate about poverty and insecurity among American farm workers, and also brought the program squarely within the immigration debates that was constantly raging. And the Shade Tobacco Growers Association was able to chart some kind of middle ground between all of these really pressing issues by constantly, sounding out that the British West Indian program is the most dependable program for small scale farmers, and that it had no equal in the United States. he also made a gigantic claim that the British West Indian program was a, quote, Marshall Plan for the Caribbean, given the economic problems that the islands face, and expressed some concern that despite being powerful patrons, he wasn't entirely sure if they were not the ones in a prostrate position, given the leverage that the Jamaican government, the British government, and then the independent Jamaican government would have. If this is a really interesting perspective in the Growers Association, kind of presenting themselves as victims in this debate. And the last two legacies I wanted to point out is the legacy of constantly pitting groups against each other. So West Indians versus Mexicans, Jamaicans versus Bajans or Barbadians and Trinidadians, Puerto Ricans versus Jamaicans. So Puerto Ricans sort of falling in that donut hole of being domestic laborers, right? Being domestic workers as US citizens, but not being able to capitalize on the assurances around like pay and sick leave and guaranteed work, etc. All of these conflicts extended into the Department of Labor and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the US Employment Services. And whereas I would say these departments were very helpful during World War II, they became less dependable allies as the program aged into the 1960s and the 1970s. And the last legacy, I would say, is that the West Indians are the largest foreign-born population in the state as of the 2010 census. And this sort of pivotal period when they come to try out Connecticut and the wartime conditions and the welcome that they received, including like exhibition games and the mayor coming out and sort of throwing the first pitch in the cricket game, the buses coming to pick them up to take them out for leisurely activities, the growers traveling all over the place trying to find cricket equipment, and totally pandering to the need for West Indians to not eat spaghetti and macaroni and cheese, but to actually have their own cooks, in stark contrast to the way that they treated Puerto Rican workers and their demands. I think it's really important that that initial welcome during World War II, I think, is what made a lot of people attracted to Connecticut and leads to the largest foreign-born population here. So the last thing on the screen is the shade tobacco growers sponsoring the West Indian, being a sponsor. It's part of the West Indian parade. They didn't put a float together, but they sent a truck with their flag here in this last screen. All right, thank you very much. Over to you, Elena. All right.
All right. Sorry, my audio cut out. Amazing, Fiona. Thank you. And now we're going to turn to Elena. I have a, I'll have my timer running, and I can message you in the chat. And there's like 3 minutes left. How about that? Okay.
That sounds good. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes?
Yep.
Okay. Can you still see it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So my name is Elena Rosario. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. And this paper is a part of a larger public dissertation project. And I just stuck with the title that Jason gave me. So I will start. My mother, Maria, migrated to Hartford, Connecticut from Ponce, Puerto Rico in the late 1960s. As a young girl in the early 1970s, she lived in the predominantly Puerto Rican Clay Hill Arsenal area of the city's North End. More specifically, Maria resided on Main Street near its intersection with Mather Street. She could see workers waiting for buses in transit to tobacco farms from her window daily. One day, she, her sister, and her niece decided to hop on one of these buses to work, even though they were under the legal working age for tobacco at the time. Maria tells how she worked one day on a tobacco farm in Windsor and even received a paycheck, but was told not to return until she was the right age to work. So here on the screen, you can see the arrow is pointing to the location that I'm discussing, and there is a picture of my mom during this time. My paper shows that the networks that led Maria to the tobacco fields that day only existed because of a process that began well over a decade earlier. The Puerto Rican community Maria lived in during this time was formed through the deliberate recruitment of Puerto Ricans as migrant farm workers. The early relationship between Connecticut's Shade Tobacco Growers Agricultural Association and the Puerto Rican's Department of Labor Migration Division's National Office sheds light on how the US and Puerto Rican governments played a significant part in the growth of a Puerto Rican diaspora in Connecticut. Today, I aim to show how the migration of Puerto Ricans to Connecticut, as facilitated by these two agencies and other community organizations like churches, laid the foundation for the Puerto Rican community of the 1960s and 1970s. This paper is presented chronologically in order to highlight how Connecticut society narrated the arrival of Puerto Ricans, primarily through local newspapers and official documents. I will answer the following questions. How did farm labor migration lead to the significant settlement of Puerto Ricans in Hartford? What was the Puerto Rican government's role in the migration and settlement of Puerto Ricans to the state? And how did local media represent the arrival of Puerto Ricans in Connecticut in the 1950s? In 1941, 16 of the largest tobacco growers in the Connecticut, Massachusetts area established the Shade Tobacco Growers Agricultural Association to oversee seasonal farm labor recruitment in Tobacco Valley. The following year, Ralph C. Lasbury Jr. of Windsor was named executive director, as Fiona just stated. In 1947, the Connecticut legislature passed an act that set the minimum age for farm laborers to 14, and the Puerto Rican government passed Public Law 89. These two laws are important because their passing helps facilitate workers' migration to Connecticut tobacco fields. New age restrictions also meant that tobacco growers had to find different sources of labor. Moreover, Public Law 89 established the Farm Labor Program and required Puerto Rican farm workers to have their government's approval to work off island. These new requirements were reaction to American growers recruiting people without any way of the government to track, manage, or regulate. The same year, Public Law 25 was passed, which established the Puerto Rican Employment Service, modeled after the United States Employment Service and housed within the Bureau of Employment and Migration. The Puerto Rican government also facilitated the Farm Labor Program through its migration division with houses in New York and Chicago, and lobbied for the US government to use Puerto Ricans in the US mainland, working with local farm organizations to facilitate the hiring of migrant workers. So here on the screen, I just have a few of the key players so that you all can see. And now I have a few images of what what it looked like. So on the left, you have what Hartford would look like at the time in the 1950s. And then you have a Windsor tobacco farm in the 1940s. The recruitment of Puerto Ricans to Connecticut began almost a decade after the founding of STGAA. In January of 1951, Clarence Sr., the Migration Division's director, and his colleague, Alan Pearl, traveled from New York to Connecticut to meet with the Shade Tobacco Growers representative and discuss labor contracts. Their arrangement would begin with the recruitment of around 300 workers for the 1952 season. The Migration Division and the Shade Tobacco Growers continued to work together throughout the year on publications to prepare for the recruitment. The US Employment Service in Hartford also put on a conference in August of 1951 to secure the placing of Puerto Rican migrants in tobacco jobs. That same year, the Migration Division worked with the Shade Tobacco Growers to publish and send brochures to over 500 farm workers and farm placement services. Members of the Migration Division's national office spent 2 days in Connecticut going over contracts with island officials on January of 1952. By March, Frank Atwood's farm news column in the Hartford Courant buzzed with the news of new migrants arriving in the state by summer. Atwood told of, I quote, an order of 300 Puerto Rican farm workers for jobs on STGAA farms, and stated that there was considerable pressure from Washington because Puerto Ricans are US citizens and should be hired before foreign workers. According to another article, tobacco workers were only to remain in the state until mid-September. Here on the screen, you have a picture of Bradley Airport in the 1950s. A flight from San Juan, Puerto Rico landed at Bradley Airport on May 7th, 1952, around 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with 60 migrant workers who came to work in the region for seasonal labor. These Puerto Ricans would join a workforce of over 20,000 that included youth work groups from the American South, area locals, student workers, and other migrants. 4 more flights arrived from Puerto Rico and Connecticut on May 12, 13, and 16, filled with 400 Puerto Ricans to go work in tobacco farms, with 100 going to work in vegetable farms. The Connecticut program was set on a trial basis, following the successful recruitment of Puerto Ricans in Massachusetts and New Jersey. On May 12, 60 workers from Puerto Rico arrived at Bradley Airport on an Eastern Airlines plane. They went to Hathaway Stein Company, Tobacco Company, which was a member of the STGA that had plantations in Suffield, Connecticut, and Southwick, Massachusetts, where they would live and work. The Shade Tobacco Growers Assistant Director, Samuel Orr Jr. of Suffield, Connecticut, recruited men who had familial responsibilities who would return to Puerto Rico, and stated that the STGAA had no intention to keep Puerto Ricans in Connecticut or make them long-term residents. Unlike previous workers, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, which meant they were not controllable by migration policies. An May 18th, 1952 article titled "Puerto Rican Workers Chosen with Extreme Care" highlights how Puerto Ricans became temporary workers in the state. Ralph Lasberry, still the director of the Shade Tobacco Growers, claimed that Puerto Ricans were being brought to Connecticut at the government's insistence, and reassured Connecticut that the STGAA took extreme precautions when selecting Puerto Rican farm laborers based on their agricultural experience and their likelihood of returning to Puerto Rico, so they would not stay after their work ended. The Shade Tobacco Growers drew on their experiences with other farm workers to shape the standards they would follow with Puerto Ricans. On April 7th of 1952, they published a pamphlet called Information for Workers, or Informaciones para Trabajadores, which lists specific requests made concerning the hiring of Puerto Ricans. As previously stated, workers were to be recruited from agricultural areas in Puerto Rico, experienced with tobacco or sugar labor, accustomed to hard farm work, in good health, between the ages of 25 and 40, and responsible for others financially. In February of 1953, a Shade Tobacco document lists 87 Puerto Rican agricultural workers currently employed in the state, with a little over 300 more scheduled to work this season. A March Current article for Farm News reiterates some of the memo's information and provides a few more details, like a pre-season conference in Hartford, where the Connecticut State Employment Service held farm placement interviews. Further, Atwood tells that the Shade Growers requested another 400 Puerto Ricans for this second season. By August of 1953, another memo to Mr. Lasberry listed the Puerto Rican migrant population as 405 in Connecticut. Officials from the Migration Division continued visiting to develop programs to support them and other Puerto Ricans who had already settled in the state. The Migration Division's 1953 annual report highlights programs such as the University of Bridgeport lecture and a pamphlet called "¿Cuáles son tus derechos civiles in Connecticut?" What are your civil rights in Connecticut? Was distributed to workers. This implies that workers were already experiencing infringements on their rights within the second season of work. Furthermore, the title suggests Puerto Ricans in Connecticut were concerned about defending their civil rights possibly based on labor exploitation in the fields, and or highlighting the opportunities that Puerto Ricans had to ask for specific rights as American citizens. The Migration Division met with the shade tobacco growers in several Connecticut cities in January of 1954, including Hartford. Moreover, their monthly report states that Lasbury was bombarding them with further changes to the 1954 contract. But after talking to Alan Pearl, they finalized the contract and sent it to Puerto Rico. By February 1954, the Migration Division calls Hartford a city of 500 Puerto Ricans. In July, Migration Division representatives attended meetings with the STGAA, as well as American insurance companies, and they returned in August to make sure that camps were up to standards. The Migration Division's monthly and 1954 annual reports discuss the progress made in the state with community organizations. They plan to visit all current Puerto Rican populations and began programs where needed, such as Hartford. They met with community leaders to work on projects like conferences and English classes, even publishing another pamphlet, Use su derecho a votar, or Exercise Your Right to Vote. These are just a few examples of the advocacy work done by the Migration Division. This shift toward advocacy in their work may have something to do with the number of people who ended up staying, even only after a few seasons of work. The Puerto Rican migrant population started modestly and grew rapidly. In March and April, Hartford Courant writer Craig Pearson wrote a series of articles about the Puerto Rican migration to the state, calling it the, and I quote, most important movement into America today. He also aimed to uncover, quote, the effect which Puerto Ricans and Connecticut are having on each other, end quote, in his series. Throughout the articles, he discusses the increase of Puerto Rican workers over the past few years and how now more than a dozen communities find themselves with new residents. There are now Puerto Rican communities in New Haven, Hartford, New Britain, Meriden, that all started because of farm work and stayed long-term. In 1955, the year began with a meeting between the Migration Division, the Connecticut Employment Service, and the STGA, and the staff of the State's Commission on Civil Rights. The Migration Division section chief also met with more than 40 ministers who made up the Greater Hartford Ministerial Fellowship on Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico in the area. Migration Division representatives also attended a farm worker meeting by the Connecticut Council of Churches, who would minister to migrant workers on farms where they lived. Moreover, the Migration Division reported in its annual report that 214 applications were received from US employers during the 1955 and 1956 year. Connecticut employers requested 1,200 Puerto Ricans. By this time, Puerto Rican migrant workers had become a significant part of Connecticut's agricultural industry, working as labor contract laborers, non-contract workers, and walk-ins. By the same time, a regional migration division was established in Hartford to support the large number of Puerto Ricans in the state. It was known as La Oficina de Commonwealth among residents and La Oficina Local de Connecticut in the region. Located at 179 Allen Street in Hartford, it opened its door with one migration specialist and one administrative assistant. In August of 1955, the Greater Hartford Community Council formed a 12-person committee on Puerto Ricans. The committee was led by Wilma Strawn Sharp, the wife of Hartford City Manager Charlton Sharp. Other members represented several organizations, including the Greater Hartford Council of Churches, the North End Community Center, Hartford Police Department, and the Shade Tobacco Growers. The number of Puerto Ricans in the city was estimated at 2,000 at this time. In 1955 and 1956, the annual report lists the number of workers in Connecticut at 12,000 and says that overall migration to the US was 98.4% higher than the previous year. In 1956, the Migration Division documents how they created a display called Our Newest Neighbors in Connecticut, the Puerto Ricans, at an annual conference for social workers. The Migration Division section chief answered questions and distributed over 1,500 pieces of literature to the public to help integrate Puerto Ricans into the larger community. After spending 2 days at the conference, the exhibit would travel to local schools, libraries, and other public spaces. In January, an information and training center opened on 397 Albany Avenue. The San Juan Catholic Center would counsel Puerto Ricans in the area on religion and also provide English classes. The 1957-1958 annual report lists some of the organizations and roles of churches in the state. A few current articles also discuss the church's role in helping Puerto Ricans and how religious leaders even followed workers to farms to meet farmers who could not take off of work for services. One article highlights Reverend Jose Negron, a Puerto Rican native, who would begin to work at an evangelical Puerto Rican church, which was housed in Central Baptist Church on Main Street, which had now been hosting Spanish services for 4 years. It becomes clear that churches are critical sites of community formation and organizing for Puerto Ricans. By 1959, the Current published another series of Puerto Ricans, this time by James Owens, titled "These Are Puerto Ricans." It highlights the experiences of Puerto Ricans in the state's capital. In the 5th article of the series, Owens discusses the role of the Migration Division's Hartford office and states, quote, "Contrary to some reports, the Puerto Rican government does not dump its unemployed in the US," end quote. This relates to a larger discourse around poverty and anti-immigration views. The article also quotes City Manager Charlton Sharp and notes that only 120 of Hartford's 6,000 Puerto Ricans were receiving state aid at the time. On April 12, 1959, a Wethersfield, Connecticut resident named Stephen Moore wrote to the Hartford Courant's editor about the series of articles on Puerto Ricans and thanked the paper for educating its readers on the problems that Puerto Ricans face in the state and about Puerto Rican cultures. Newspapers played a role in introducing Puerto Ricans to the local white community. To conclude, this paper examines how the migration to Connecticut's Tobacco Valley directly led to the development of a Puerto Rican diaspora in Greater Hartford that still exists and thrives to this day. What makes the story even more interesting is that Puerto Rican farm workers were expected to return to the island when the tobacco season ended. Still, by the later part of the 1950s, Puerto Ricans were being integrated into Connecticut society with aid of several local and state actors. The city of Hartford and local organizations worked with migrant workers as they became Puerto Rican residents of Hartford. I hope this paper offers some explanations of how the community was formed through a particular set of conditions that were created by the Shade Tobacco Growers Agricultural Association and the Migration Division, along with other advocates like churches and community organizations. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Elena. Thank you so much. I have so many questions right now. And I really love how these presentations overlap and situate each other. But I want to open up first to questions from attendees or other panelists. I think you can just drop them in the chat too, if that works for you.
Chris has his hand raised.
Oh, sorry. Yes, please go ahead, Chris. You have to unmute.
Yes, thank you. And despite what it says, I'm Chris Clark, not Fiona Vernal. Thank you very much for these 3 fascinating papers. I mean, they're of great interest to me for many reasons. And among that is that I did some work on the 19th century tobacco industry in Connecticut and Massachusetts, really up to the Civil War. And so Jason's paper and Fiona's in particular prompt some questions about how the stories you're telling would connect back to the origins of tobacco growing. So some of these are just really sort of technical questions. Am I correct in thinking that the tobacco leaf that is being grown in Connecticut is mainly for cigar wrappers? In other words, these are not producing the material for complete cigars. That used to be the case in the 19th century. And so it seems that there's a dimension of this, which is that not only in the history of labor, but also in the history of the product itself. This is part of a global is probably too big, but this is not producing a complete product. This is producing material that then goes somewhere else to be assembled in, classic industrial capitalist way. And that, if that's true, that seems to underscore the point about the global and colonialist dimensions of this. But the second question is really, does this reliance on quasi sort of plantation style labor originate with the World War II labor shortage, which you've both in some ways emphasized, well, you've all in some ways emphasized, or is the migration of West Indian and Puerto Rican workers into this system replacing comparable groups of migrant workers who had come from elsewhere before? Or are they replacing, as it were, local, often family workers who are employed in on small farms and so forth? So that's just a question about this fascinating topic. Thank you.
Yeah, I can take the first question, and then Jason can jump in and enhance what I've said, which is that shade tobacco does produce this boutique industry that is really important to say the pride of Connecticut, right? And the agricultural experimentation station is always engaged in ways to improve the labor process, improve the production process. So yes, it's definitely for cigars, and then it gets its own, promotion and its own press and cigar aficionado. But of course, cigarettes become their biggest enemies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Chris, for those questions. Yeah, when I was looking at some of the early Connecticut, or the 1870s, 1880s conversations in the agricultural, the state agriculture board, the references to growing tobacco weren't even for smoking, that they were growing this and creating sort of, livestock washes, because the nicotine in the tobacco is an insecticide. And so they weren't even really, at least the ones who were speaking up at the time, weren't even really growing it for that. I think in part because so many other places had outpriced them, and that those circuits of production for smoking tobacco were produced elsewhere. And the entrance of shade-grown tobacco for that, like what Fiona's talking about, this boutique kind of thing, was an effort to replace the domestically the wrappers grown in colonies that were then used, that were then rolled in those places, right? Because leading up to that turn of the century, invention of the shade-grown tobacco in Connecticut, there were other tobacco labor strikes in cigar rolling and cigarette rolling, industries across, the sort of Appalachia and then into parts of California. And so I think one of the things they were very careful about was like not wanting to bring production and those kinds of labor troubles to the state, but just center in on this high value commodity that they could grow and out and through trade policies suppress those locally grown in the colonies. And so they get the export value, right, in which there are existing, sort of means of producing cigars for, from the traditions of rolling cigars in those spaces. Perhaps there's one. Oh, I would love to talk more and learn from you about these earlier practices of tobacco production, because I think there is some continuity there, and to try to think from the grower's eyes what the future could look like given those certain circumstances. So I think there was a kind of anticipation of something, but the fact that it grew so quickly, and it grew into and absorbed all of these different kinds of what you could call like vulnerable or surplus labor that was either immigrant or youth labor, or and then I think that dovetails into the programs that brought up college students from HBCUs and then also college women that I showed from Florida. So all of those, I think it was a constant kind of problem solving kind of thing, but never an investment in that the labor was meant to be valuable, in that they could be neighbors, or that they would live in the same space that they worked, right? That they could go away after harvest.
The only other thing I wanted to say to that I find interesting in your question, Chris, is how the shade tobacco growers, they're very sort of proud of their lineage, right? So Lasbury's father was a tobacco grower, and he also marries into the Thrall family, who are also big tobacco folks. And one of the ways that they try to mute this idea that this is a plantation labor scheme updated is by emphasizing that they too worked in tobacco, when they were young. And then they also tried to mute the participation of youth and women and sort of family labor, to say like, it's just all one and the same. And I think what's powerful about the Lasbury collection is how honest they are, and self reflexive about their because of the labor bottlenecks and because of the different pools of labor that they're pulling on. In response to Doug's question, I think the 1936 report about how many workers there are in tobacco is like 7,000. And then if you count the seasonal one, the figure is like 13,000. But I think the small growers are ever defensive because they don't have a reliable pool of labor. And once the age 14 is the cutoff point, right, it's really difficult to figure out how they're going to, like who's going to like bend over and pick the, and pluck the small leaves. And they're also really defensive in relation to all the auxiliary industries that grow up around shade tobacco. Just sort of gets pulled out from under them, right? And it's Philly and New York that becomes the center of trade. And so every decade, right, you see them like holding on to the one thing they think they can still control, which is the actual beginning of the production phase that generates the shade tobacco in the first place, because the trade is out of their hands. It's with merchants. They're all of these middlemen who are also making money hand over fist. And a lot of the farmers are small-time farmers, and a lot of them are in a lot of debt because the corporations come in. The American Sumatra Company comes in and buys up all of this land and then end up leasing it back to these indebted farmers. So they do tell this tale of kind of being under siege while also holding out this idea that their relations, with workers of color is really paternalistic, and with like white workers, especially women, right? Like this is a vacation and we provide swimming for them, and we bus them and we secure their safety.
I would just add for briefly, I think it touches on both questions and Doug's question. What I've noticed, even though I start a little later in the 40s, but I looked at a lot of Windsor Historical Society. I looked at like some Windsor town papers to kind of figure out if Windsor was talking about any of this stuff in the way that the Hartford Courant or the Hartford Times was. And one thing that I did find, I think it was from like 40, it might've been like 48 or 49. There was a series of articles, and it was about a bunch of Southern Black men that were fed up with the conditions on the farm. And so they left. And so one thing that I think happens, to answer Doug's question about the difference between the domestic workforce, is that as you're getting these migrant workers coming in, people are understanding their role differently. And so you get like, a lot of times we hear about MLK working in the tobacco fields, and for him, that was a very transformative experience. But when you hear about people that came after him, they're like, we had to walk out of there. Like the organizing was the transformative experience, not the working of the tobacco. So there's this shift that happens that I think that I've only been able to really kind of find through newspapers. But, and I think that that's an interesting thing to trace, maybe why you get this shift from local domestics, because there is this weird thing that happens where you hear, I mean, a lot of regular Connecticut older folks will say, I worked in the tobacco field, but they won't have the same understanding of it in the sense like my mom as a Puerto Rican migrant has of what the tobacco field means. And so I think that all of this is like interplaying together. And I think that people are seeing the way other people are getting treated or the ways that other people are organizing, and it's bouncing off of each other. And so you definitely get like kind of lose the, you know, the pretty Florida girls, even though in the source that Jason cited, like the Tobacco magazine, they literally say like, come and spend time with the Florida girls, you know, and that's very different. So
on the Great Migration of African Americans, one of the things that helps with the bargaining position that African American workers come to have, in addition to just being domestic workers like Puerto Ricans, is that at the time that shade tobacco production is increasing, and I think Jason's chart showed like in the 1920s, right, is like the peak. It's also the same time for African Americans to find really good manufacturing jobs and jobs in the defense industry. And eventually the Growers Association has to, you know, after its recruiting efforts with historically Black colleges and also their own Southern roots, like a lot of these growers associations had like relatives from down South who could help them, you know, recruit laborers, which is part of the reason why you have this chain migration of folks from Georgia, so that by 1930, 40% of the African American population in Hartford hails from Georgia. And shade tobacco growing and that chain migration of bringing your uncle and your friends, as well as the PR campaign of the HBCU workers, helps to keep this migration train up. But as African Americans settle, they have so many other options, right? And it's only really the day hall system that they use to continue working in tobacco. But everybody shifts out of this industry as soon as they can. It's great for some of the students in terms of, you know, as a college kid earning a lot of money in a really short, like maybe 3-month period, but as an adult who needs to support a family, not so much. And there's no, you know, you may become a supervisor, but there's that ceiling stops very quickly in terms of being able to get better work in the same industry.
You know, I want to thank you for this awesome conversation, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of a break and preserve time for the second panel. I want to just add one other piece. I think is I didn't realize how significant that the role of the state in both the government at many scales in generating the conditions for the expansion of this industry, and also the ways that, say, like the growers, in combination with international players and the United States government, generated problems that the city then had to step in and negotiate, right? So even though there are multiple state actors, they're not all, you know, trying to solve the same problem. And so I find that just really fascinating to think about the image of tobacco in the state today as this kind of quaint, rural, kind of backdrop to the, to a suburban kind of life. But real, the deeper story here, I think, is a story about capitalism and the way that the growers were able to steer the wheel of government to take advantage of imperial politics and imperial expansion, the access to colonial sources of labor and markets, and squeeze out of the land and the labor as much as they could for this commodity. So, and I think that, this is a fantastic, sort of foundation to then think about the ways that we, the next panel can, think about what happens inside the valley and outside of the valley, and the ways that cultural representation and expressive culture can tell those stories and to demonstrate the kind of rippling effects of what's happened here, and how that echoes around in other sites. So
welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. We have our last and second part of our symposium. Thank you for hanging in there and being with us. As Jason said, we're trying to build a research collective because there is so much work to be done, especially when you think, when you think about how this spreads into the entire Connecticut River Valley and all of the nascent communities, all of the nascent communities that grew up because this was one of the ways for people to be introduced to Connecticut and Massachusetts, right? So our second panel involves our other partners in the New England Humanities Collaborative. So we've got Sony Coráñez Bolton from Amherst College. We have UConn alum, Amy Loisel, who's on a postdoc at Smith College, Alicia Bright Holland, and Kristen Morgan, who, if you guys could just remind us again that your program is going to premiere when?
May 1st.
May 1st, and we'll send out, I'll put a link in the chat actually for.
All right, so we're all looking forward to that performance. So without ado, our second panel.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. We're still in the morning. Sorry, I didn't greet everybody. I was kind of, Zoom can be awkward sometimes, but it was really lovely to hear the first panel. And for this, at least the way I'll start it off, I'm definitely focusing on what Jason said on the outside of the valley type of stuff. So I'm not an historian by training. I'm more, I guess, a genealogical Foucauldian thinker, cultural theorist. And so that's the training I'll be bringing to this talk. So I'll share my screen if I can. We are here. Okay. I assume this is visible to everybody? Okay, great, thank you. Okay. All right. So the title of my talk today is Manifest Disablement. And obviously this is a play on Manifest Destiny. And so my work is actually centered in the Philippines and actually cultural discourses of the racial logic of mestizaje and racial mixture in this Asian context. So I actually take a lot of inspiration from Jason's work in doing that. He's kind of a little bit of an icon of like Asian Americanist studies approaches to kind of mestizaje and racial mixture. I actually cite him quite heavily. So I was very pleased to be invited to the Shade Collective, even though I'm not necessarily doing granular analytical work on things that are happening in the Valley. My work actually made me sort of interested in sort of the discourses that anteceded Trans-Pacific empire building located in the American West, which is why the focus on Manifest Destiny in this particular instance. So just a little bit of an overview. So the geographic frame is westward expansion, generally speaking. And I'm really kind of curious about how we might be able to connect these epochal shifts in American race relations, emblematized by the dates of 1848 and 1898. Obviously, this is going to be very resonant to everyone on the call. But, 1848 being, the time period in which a large portion of Mexican territory that existed under a Spanish racial state or the logics thereof passes under kind of a different racial state, right? And then 1898, similar thing for my context in the Philippines, right? And so I'm really trying to think about sort of a capacious theoretical framework that could account for a number of political phenomena and what I call a racialized colonial genealogy for disability and embodiment. So I'm talking particularly to disability studies. And I think that could be of interest to us because disability studies, and I'll give a primer of what this field is and how it orients itself, because it is really attentive to notions of the body, embodiment, notions of work and labor and care. And so I think that it could be a really interesting and hopefully useful way to kind of orient a lot of the, I think, historical work that's happening, or at least my discoursing with it in these kind of particular theoretical debates. I'm also thinking a lot in this talk about the critical race theory or notion by Cheryl Harris of whiteness being a form of property, and really trying to expand that line of thinking in critical race thought to a more global framework of colonial racism, right? That for me, and this is the claim of my talk, is that ability itself is a form of property, right? And I'll explain, hopefully I'll clarify what that means, right? And so the source, the evidence for this talk is actually engaging with a really foundational text in American studies literature, and Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier Thesis, which I think is a very emblematic, right? I read it, actually I went to the American culture, I got my PhD in American culture at Michigan, so go blue. But this was like the first reading that we received in our graduate pro-summer, like, this is American studies. And it's like, oh, what is it, right? And so I'm interested in sort of reading against the grain of this text and perhaps a little bit against my field of training. So that's the overview. But to begin, I really wanted to try to connect with the framework of tobacco and the tobacco plant itself. And I found something quite interesting that perhaps you're aware of. And also the title of the slide is Crip Coloniality. And so coloniality is, referencing Aníbal Quijano's sort of coloniality of power, in which he defines and tracks the modern sensibility of race as a heuristic through which colonial powers organize labor relations, right? And so race itself is a product of labor, right, in this framework. And what I found is there's this phrase in Spanish historically that el tobacco se ha mulato, the tobacco has become mulatto. And this was actually coined or written by Jules Cerveau, a French scientist, and analyzing and identifying tobacco, what we call today tobacco mosaic disease, which a number of you are probably familiar with. And it's actually the earliest recorded descriptor of viral infection ever, ever, right? The first pathogen to be defined, identified as a virus. And so for me, this is interesting, right? Not only is there kind of a callback to Ortiz's, like tobacco has always been mulatto, but it indexes racial mixture itself, right? Racial mixture itself is indexical of disease, debilitation, disability, right? And tobacco mosaic disease essentially is a virus that causes mosaic-like mottling and discoloration on the leaves, right? Which effectively kind of kills the plant. And so the tobacco plant itself inaugurated the field, the literal field of virology, as we know it, which is very apropos for our time. So it's a very important commodity, a very important plant, right? And so for me, what interests what interests me is this linkage of debility and disease to commodity production reliant on exploited Black and Indigenous labor. And so I'll get into more what my interests are in that. But a little bit more broadly speaking, just to give a little bit of shine to the Philippines right, in this collective, and my interest in mestizaje itself, is that the way I think about it, maybe this could be productive for you, is that I read it as a eugenic reproductive logic in the Philippines, right, that facilitated normative conjugal relations as coextensive with national identity, right? In the Philippines, but also Latin America. And the context I'm most familiar with would be Mexico and Jose Vasconcelos and La Raza Cósmica, in which he does this work. And it's kind of an iconic sort of rendition of mestizo thought. And it purports to present the Indian or Indio as cognitively and physically incapable of democratic self-rule, who then must be rehabilitated by mestizos, or white people, to approximate able-bodied and able-minded humanity. So that's the general argument actually of my book. But I began thinking about like the way I saw US colonial kind of administrative colonialism in the Philippines actually adopting and refracting sort of settler colonial ideology in the United States and sort of transposed it to the Philippine context. And so that's one of the reasons why I focus on the Philippines. And then other reasons are, it's an interesting case study to sort of track, right, the intersection of Spanish humanism. I remember this kind of transition from like a Spanish racial state to a US one, and US liberalism on the other hand, of which I kind of consider the frontier thesis being a part. And also to understand why the Philippines, or why any, sort of notions of the body and embodiment outside of a European American context, I think we need a little bit of a quick primer on disability studies. So hopefully this will be helpful. So disability studies emerges out of the disability rights movement in the 1970s, right, in 1980s. And a particularly like interesting and kind of iconic sort of flashpoint in this movement is actually Gallaudet University in Washington, DC, which is a liberal arts college that became university for the deaf and hard of hearing, right? And they were agitating for and protesting for a deaf president because they never had a deaf president. And then just a few years later, we get the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I really want us to understand that the ADA, of which all of our institutions are legally mandated to be compliant with, right? But some institutions do better than others, is not like this moment of like benevolence of the state. It is really coming out of history of movement building, right? So it is people who identify with their disability, and so in similar ways that ethnic nationalist movements, the Chicano movement, the women's movement kind of, rallied around and organized around an identity. And so in canonical disability studies, there are two models that are differentiated. One's called the medical model. So this is essentially saying that, oh, there's something wrong with you. We're not actually going to talk to the patient. We're going to organize all medical thought to correct this deficiency that's in you. Versus the social model, which was coined as by Mike Oliver, a wheelchair user, kind of disability rights activist in the United Kingdom, to teach his social work students how to better approach people with disabilities and kind of actually respect their experience and their identification with it, is to not locate disability as a deficiency within the individual, but rather as a product of interaction with the socio-political environment. So what do I mean by that? So there's nothing inherently disabling about bodily variation per se, right? It's only when a body interacts with a particular environment that a disability is created. So it becomes a problem of access and accommodation. So this is powerful because then disability becomes a political problem that requires collective social solutions rather than there's something wrong with you. Please learn to walk so you can enter this building, right? Would be a medical, right? And then it kind of flags the way we organize social space, who we want to navigate it, versus a social model like you put in the wheelchair ramp. So different bodies can enter the building, right? So that's a low-hanging fruit example, but we can kind of expand it and complicate it. I identify as a crip theorist. So crip is short for crippled, right? So a reappropriated term to give it a more positive energy, much like queer. And it actually de-emphasizes disability identity in favor of a reading method, right? That foregrounds subjects that would not necessarily identify or as being affected by disability or being disabled. So it's similar to queer, right? where queer theory is actually not actually interested in archival subjects that would identify as gay or lesbian. Queer theorists, actually, we aren't interested in that, which is kind of counterintuitive, but rather what are those institutions and ideologies that shape our assumptions around sexuality? Similar for crip theory. So we might think of, I have some examples here, we might think of the Flint water crisis and environmental racism generally as predisposing entire communities to debilitation and disability. A crip theorist would say, oh, disability studies should care about this. Whether or not Flint residents would identify as disabled, they probably don't, you know, but that's not the issue, right? I think I'm being clear here. Or COVID-19's differential impact on different communities based on variables that shouldn't affect your survivability for a virus, but they do. Exposure of farm workers to pesticides, which was like a very main kind of political rallying point for the United Farm Workers movement. Could we consider this as part of a disability history? On my interests, more generally, like in imperial war and militarization, and generally resource deprivation or lack of access to medical care, right? And so this is an important point because in disability studies, there's a presumption in the US or European framework of what exceptional embodiment looks like a limbless body. And it presents like ontological questions of what we think bodies should do or what they should look like, or what bodies we should be able to see. But if you look at like, you know, Southeast Asia and places that have been, you know, kind of defined through the proxy wars of the Cold War and landmines, the limbless body is not an exceptional form of embodiment, right? And so I think so expanding it to a more global framework, that's the kind of politics, right? So essentially, disability studies has traditionally been a very white field and has privileged the white veteran male wheelchair user, of usually a veteran of US imperial wars. And so there's a little bit, not to say that we shouldn't pay attention to that population, we absolutely should, but it has become the kind of central figure around which disability, of who can produce disability thought. I'm happy to take questions about this if this is not clear and during the Q&A. And I also would like us to kind of appreciate that disability as a framework generally for understanding social progress, like historically. So it has often been an analog for social exclusion. So maybe this will reorient some people's sort of thoughts around some of these histories. So arguments against women's suffrage, they were too emotional, too hysterical to be able to vote, right? Racial science and eugenics, I don't think that, right? Like phrenology, craniology, ethnology to a lesser extent, like literally physically, you know, measuring cognitive capacity as a function of volume of the cranium, right? Sexology and sex sciences, classifications of gender disorders, homosexuality's pathologies to be corrected, or transgender folks today, like their ability to access healthcare being predicated on confessing to illness. I'm sick, right? Even though they might not think of themselves that way. And then for me, progressivist discourses of uplift and social betterment through reform. And more apropos, developmentalist discourse of racial uplift and colonialism as being part of disability history. Okay, so there's the prologue. So now let's kind of get into kind of like my interests, right? And so I have this pretty pedagogical image that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. If you don't teach with it, I recommend that you do, because you could spend like 45 minutes, students just pointing out what's in this image. And it connects all of us. It connects everybody, almost everybody virtually, right? So I think it's very pedagogical and productive in that sense. And so we have, you know, School Begins, published in a satirical magazine called Puck in 1899 or 1900. I see these 2 years, 1899 or 1900, maybe someone could correct me. And we have it kind of allegorizing US imperialism as a project of education, educative reform and rehabilitation of this new class of US empire, right? With the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, right? Connecting kind of, you know, the Philippines to the Pacific and also to the Hispanic Caribbean, right? In this instance, right? And then we have like these abject racial failures in the background in which, so we see that the global kind of projection of empire is really reliant on these domestic formulations of, you know, race. So racial subjects that the United States failed to rehabilitate, right? So we have the, you know, Jim Crow-fied African-American labor who's in the classroom, right? But is reduced to kind of a laboring body. And he's almost like looking to the center. Perhaps he would like to be in the class, but he's excluded from it. right? And then for me, we could see that the whole project of US empire building is like predicated on, right, this disenfranchised and hyper exploitation of the Black body. And then we have the Chinese coolie, marked pretty perversely by his queue. And so this is clearly kind of a reference to the Chinese Exclusion Act. He's literally at the door, he can't come in. He's queer and perverse, right? And then this image for me is really interesting and kind of harkens back to my definition of mestizaje as the rehabilitation of the Indian, right? And so we have the North American Indian who's holding his book upside down, but the letters are reversed, actually. It was brought to my attention. And he plays the dunce figure in the classroom, right? He's the dunce, but instead of the dunce, it's the indigenous headdress, right? So you can kind of see he's on a timeout in the way you would see kind of like children with the dunce cap, children that are marked as idiots, right? Or pinheads would be the term that was used in vogue at the time. And for me, I'm interested in this, right? In the back of the class, who's the rehabilitated white, right, proper kind of gender conforming subjects are states, and with the exception of Alaska here, are states in the US Southwest, right? So we have Texas, we have Arizona, California, and actually I can't see this one. This is New Mexico, right? And so this got me to thinking, okay, I think I need to inch a little bit back to the American West and thinking about like what are the kind of, to think a little bit more genealogically about what I was seeing in the Philippines. And so this brings me to the frontier thesis. Sorry, there's a lot of preamble. I felt like I need to explain myself. So for those of you that aren't familiar, Frederick Jackson Turner was, I think he was 25 years old at the time, like a very kind of prodigy, right? He gave a talk at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison in 1893, in which he coins this term or this notion of the frontier thesis. And this is important. I don't need to tell a room of historians this, but it was one of, to my knowledge, like one of the first instances in which American history was articulated as its own field of research. It's an object of analysis. And so the kind of the problematic, or the polemic that Turner was sort of paying attention to was like, is American culture its own separate thing? Or is it just merely an extension of European institutions and thought? And he's like, no, it's a separate thing. And the reason why it's a separate thing is because of the frontier, right? The frontier was the source of American ingenuity, creativity, and capitalist innovation, right? And also this text, if you haven't read it, it's a fascinating read. It's also a eulogy of sorts. So we've acquired the port at San Francisco, we, the United States. There's no more frontier, right? There's no more frontier. So this epochal end of this a movement in American history, or is there no more frontier? I don't know. We know what happened. We know what the historical record showed, right? And so I thought, I don't know how much time I have left, but I have a few pages from this essay on manifest disablement I'd like to read to you, but feel free to cut me off. In which I kind of explain kind of why manifest disablement's a thing. And then I'll just conclude with that. And this kind of close readings, textual analysis of the essay itself. So thank you for indulging me. So the formation of the US American racial state was predicated on, as scholars like Cheryl Harris have explicated, the consolidation of whiteness as also a form of property. And also, I would add, the integration of whiteness into the idealized form of an able-bodied laboring pioneer. In a moment where Harris clearly articulates her main argument, I detect a discursive shift from thinking through the legal discourse of propertied whiteness to its attendant articulation to a physical body, assumed to be able-bodied. And so I have a quote here. Whiteness defined the legal status of a person as slave or free. The assumption of American law as it related to Native Americans was that conquest did give rise to sovereignty. Indians experienced the property laws of the colonizers and the emergent American nation as acts of violence perpetuated by the exercise of power and ratified through the rule of law. At the same time, these laws were perceived as custom and common sense by the colonizers. The founders, for instance, so thoroughly embraced Lockean labor theory as the basis for the right of acquisition because it affirmed the right of the New World settlers to settle on and acquire the frontier. It confirmed and ratified their experience. Property, in this broader sense, encompassed jobs, entitlements, occupational licenses, contracts and subsidies, and indeed a whole host of intangibles that are the product of labor, time, and creativity. So I want to suggest, through an engagement with Harris's foundational essay, that white property is the realm in which race and disability politically and empirically intersect. While Harris's pioneering work shows that the augmentation of white property materialized through settler colonialism and slavery working in tandem, I suggest that another equally important structure animates the logics of dispossession here, rooted in a colonial ideology of ability. The seeds to this analysis are actually already found in Harris's initial intervention, in which she observes that property is a social relation that is produced through a whole host of intangibles that are the product of labor, time, and creativity. Harris's invocation of the frontier demonstrates the extent to which, as she puts it, Lockean understandings of the laboring body reify whiteness into property as a function of work. Evidence of the ways that a laboring able body affirms the right to frontier property can be found in a particularly evocative part of Turner's essay, in which he describes the body that can literally physically cross into frontier lands. Frontier. This is kind of an iconic part of the essay. The frontier finds him, the American pioneer, a European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. It takes him from the railroad car and puts him in the birch canoe. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and the moccasin. It puts him in the log cabin of the Cherokee and the Iroquois and runs an Indian palisade around him. Before long, he has gone to planting Indian corn and plowing with the sharp stick. He shouts the war cry and takes the scalp in orthodox Indian fashion. In short, at the frontier, the environment is at first too strong for the man. He must accept the conditions which it furnishes or perish. And so he fits himself into the Indian clearings and follows the Indian trails. So Jason brought up the playing Indian part. This is kind of perhaps one of the iconic historical implications of this. So this passage points to one of the main political tensions at the heart of Turner's intellectual project of founding today what would be called American studies. Was America its own distinct culture or entity, or with its own separate history, or was it merely an extension of European culture and institutions? Turner's answer lies in the ways that the American pioneer is arrayed in the hunting shirt and the moccasin, and finds himself essentially an Indian. For Turner, this description of the American pioneer transforming himself into an Indian demonstrates that the most important factor that differentiated European thought from that of America was the frontier, and concomitantly the body that actualized and was actualized by the work required to dominate the frontier, right? So essentially, and I'll just end here quickly, I have a little bit more to read, but I feel anxious that I'm taking too much time, is that so the ability becomes a property of whiteness through this racial drag of becoming an Indian, in which the Indian body performs these labors of the frontier that are too harsh for the American man, the white pioneer man, but then becomes kind of prostheticized, right? Becomes a prosthetic device that actually attaches a different type of American embodied, like ability to the pioneer body. And so that's pretty abstract, but I think hopefully it could be useful to kind of thinking kind of expansively and theoretically abstractly about labor and the body and what our assumptions of its capacities are. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.
I'll just mute myself now.
Amy?
Thanks so much. And thanks all the previous presenters. Those are great ideas. So I'm Amy Loisel, and yes, I do want to thank Jason and Fiona for putting this together, and also El Instituto at UConn for supporting a lot of the research that went into the chapters of my project that related to Puerto Rican needleworkers. And let me share my screen here. So I'm going to start the presentation with an image of Puerto Rican women in a way that I think a lot of people don't imagine them today, and that is as industrial workers. So here they're at a union hall, and they're learning new sewing techniques. And you can see the woman standing on the left is Gloria Maldonado. She's a key part of my project. I don't mention her again in this presentation, but she actually is a labor leader in education director. She ends up teaching extension classes at Rutgers, and the women that she's working with there are all union members. And I think this is really important because it's going to connect to the last slide I show you. So keep this in mind, that this is in 1973, Puerto Rican women as industrial workers. And the main point of this presentation is that we lose this idea of Puerto Rican women as industrial workers, and we lose their public legacy in the Northeast, while farm workers' legacy actually continues in a particular organization that I focus on, which is called the New England Farm Workers Council, which I first heard when I was working in nonprofits in Springfield and Holyoke area. It was called NEFWIC. And people would be like, did you get your NEFWIC voucher? Or did you get your NEFWIC paper? Or did you go to NEFWIC for that? So it's a very big part of this area. And what I argue is that part of the reason that the industrial needleworkers phase out, whereas NEFWIC and this idea of farm workers remains, is partially the condition of the work, is that manufacturing can disaggregate in a way that shade tobacco growing can't. And it is disaggregated, as Jason and Fiona and Chris talked about earlier, but it's not in the same way that manufacturing. And that Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican women were actually key to the start of this disaggregation and in the 20th century. Secondly, gender, that women are not really traditionally seen, whether they're Puerto Rican women or Quebecois women like Fiona talked about. They're both key to New England factories, but they're not considered industrial workers in the kind of gendered meanings of what does it mean to be a factory worker in the Northeast. And then lastly is the structure of their organizing. Puerto Rican needleworkers organized with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So they organize primarily through an international US-based labor union, whereas farm workers, as part of this movement that they join in the 70s, the farm workers create this council, which is not hampered by the NLRB process or by certain like certification requirements. And the council was actually, because it's not a labor union and was like a workers collective, eventually becomes a main conduit for public-private contracting for workforce, through workforce development. So because of all of these three reasons, NEFWIC becomes a giant powerhouse in the Springfield Holyoke area, whereas Puerto Rican needleworkers and the ILGW really phase out and are not part of contemporary public memory. So in my work, I am interested primarily in Puerto Rican needleworkers in this area. I think there's a lot of studies about Puerto Rican needleworkers in major centers like New York City or Philadelphia. And those are vital histories that I rely on for their analysis. But when I was doing the research, I started to realize there were workers migrating out to Connecticut and Massachusetts as late as the late 1970s. And that really is a major challenge to the industrial narrative of the United States. And I think when we look at the women workers and not at factory relocation, what we see is the real roots of the global working class, which is, as Fiona pointed out in hers, these are not massive quantities. These are not the same quantity of workers that are like down in like North Carolina working in textile factories, but they are lubricating and moving products and capital and labor in ways that are actually become the model of late 20th and early 21st century labor and manufacturing, which is small, light, migrating workforces sprawled across large manufacturing hubs. And so it's colonial and imperial labor that's really the source of late 20th century manufacturing models, not the kind of the north-south narrative that you often get when you look at traditional labor history. And so I'm always looking for the little fragments though, because it's really hard to find the Puerto Rican needleworkers in these areas, but they are there. I found newspaper articles and oral histories, and they're in New Haven and Bridgeport and Hartford and Willimantic and Springfield and Holyoke, right through, like I said, until the 1980s. So it's a very different time frame. So looking at this slide, I just want to, note that at the same time that tobacco and sugar are being focused on in Puerto Rico, so are needleworkers. It's not something that comes later. Right from the get-go, U.S. retailers and importers and manufacturers realize, whoa, the Spanish Empire had a whole network of insular contractors that would put out piecework to these women. So they were already trained. This isn't like the US bringing industrialization to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rican women already knew how to crank out the piecework, and they were skilled at doing so. And you can see the woman on the left, you just bring the sewing machine out into the street if you have to, and get the work done to turn the pieces into the agents. So from a very early time, and the South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition had the idea of this cotton empire of the US shall now include Puerto Rico. And this was very specifically around cotton, textiles, and apparel. It wasn't interested in a world exposition. It wasn't interested in other products. It was interested in how do we link the Caribbean, the South, and the Northeast into a giant cotton regime from plantation to finished product. And when I found this, I was super excited. Unfortunately, it's in an archive that's since closed due to lack of funding, but I'm sure the material got somewhere. But it's so explicitly around cotton that I think, sugar and tobacco get much deserved attention, but I think we want to realize that this colonial industrialization was important too. And at the same time, they're looking at tobacco. And as Jason pointed out, that these markets are being manufactured and kind of reconstructed by the US state and by colonial efforts. And they're redirecting tobacco and coffee away from Cuba. So Puerto Rico had been exporting a lot of these products to Cuba as part of the Spanish Empire. The US blocks that and says, you're not going to send that stuff to Cuba anymore. And in the rearranging, more and more women have to take on needlework in order to make up for the loss of income and this kind of turbulence in the commodities markets around tobacco and coffee. Coffee is a little bit more impacted than tobacco because I don't want to go into the details of the economics of it, but just the way the commodities markets were operating, especially in coffee regions, women had to take on needlework in order to make up for the loss. And as women become more and more part of this larger colonial US industrial labor, by the 1920s, they're already migrating into the New York City. So these are Puerto Rican needleworkers whose oral histories I found, who by the 1920s, they're already living in New York City. And several of them talk about the fact that their mother and their sisters all run sewing machines all day long in their apartment until they can get jobs in the sweatshops in New York and garment shops in New York City. So again, this is a much earlier time frame of workers migrating from colonial areas into the Northeast. Not that if you track manufacturing or factories, it looks like everything's going south, south, south. But if you look at the women and the workers, they're moving in multiple directions. And like I said, they're carrying labor practices, labor models, and capital with them as they go. They're not bearing the capital, but the capital is moving with them in parallel tracks. And I also want to note that Luis Delgado and Eva Monge end up becoming business agents for the ILGWU. So these women are also becoming union members and active from a much earlier time than people talk about. So tobacco workers, as we've noted, are also migrating into this area at this time. So you have these dual migrations going on. You have Puerto Rican women and needleworkers coming from Puerto Rico, and you also have the tobacco workers coming from Puerto Rico. And what Elena talked about, the migration division is fueling all of this. So just like with the tobacco workers, the migration division is heavily involved in the process of helping needleworkers move. And there's quite a few regional offices. So there's regional offices in Hartford, Boston, Rochester, New York. And so again, the migration division in New York City tends to get a lot of attention, but it was very active out here, as Elena's already talked about. And they would do job orders of, companies could go to the Puerto Rican Department of Labor Migration Division and say, we need 5 women to sew, just like they could go and say, we need 40 farm workers to come to the fields. And the women, though, by this time are already organizing. And like I said, they're deeply entrenched in this. So the earliest ILGWU activists were on the island in the 1920s. The ILGWU was very active from Canada to Puerto Rico to California. They were very committed to trying to organize across borders. They did not view Puerto Rico as a place that was like at a remove. And they actually had many papers that they said, as long as we keep paying Puerto Rican workers less than on the mainland, we are undercutting mainland wages. So they understood by the 1930s what people are still struggling to talk about today, which is you need like a blanket minimum wage for everybody, and you need citizenship access and access to labor grievances for all workers, not just on the continental US or the 50 states, but across all areas. And as you can see in the lower right, they were actually organizing, that newspapers from 1955, that New York Puerto Rican women workers were saying, we need to fight the island sweatshops too, not just fighting for better conditions in New York City. So they were, and unfortunately you can see in the upper left picture, as the Puerto Rican women became more and more active, they got squeezed out of leadership roles, and you had more and more of the men labor organizers on the island and from the United States taking leadership roles. But women were always super active. The biggest dress workers strike was in 1958, and it was actually a 7-state strike because the ILGWU was concerned that workers and shops were moving out of the city to Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Jersey. So their fears weren't that work is going to the South, which is again the dominant U.S. labor history narrative. Their concern was these shops are going to the suburbs and to the and initially their concern was it was going to like Long Island and the Bronx, but that real estate got too expensive too, so they start moving out. And this is that part of the disaggregation that I think ends up destabilizing how Puerto Rican women, move into the economy in the late 20th century, which is different than farm workers who are still, by the 1970s, are still a very regular and regularized labor force in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So here you see, this is Madison Square Garden. They actually filled Madison Square Garden with striking workers. And workers struck in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, New York State, all to say that if you were going to move your shop, you had to provide severance to your workers, that you couldn't just up and move your shop from Manhattan or the Bronx out to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and just leave the New York workers with nothing. And then there was also claims, because what these companies and managers did when they moved to Connecticut was, of course, drop the wages also, because the shops were mostly non-union at first until workers could organize. And so we want to say, like, at this time, there were ILGW union shops eventually in Stamford, Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury. There were also a lot of non-union shops, though. So I just want to do a quick interlude here, because at one point I was going to shift my project for this symposium to oral history I was doing with a friend of mine. We both had uncles who had worked in tobacco. My uncle worked down in Meriden, Connecticut, and her uncle worked from Springfield out to the ones around Westfield and Enfield and Suffield. But my uncle worked in the 50s and 60s, and he was coming from a poor working class neighborhood bus to Portland, Connecticut, whereas her uncle was bused from housing. So he lived in tobacco housing in Springfield that was specifically for workers. When my uncle worked in it, it was the 50s and 60s, so it was strictly segregated. White workers and Puerto Rican workers didn't mix. My uncle's passed away, so I couldn't talk to him, but I talked to family members, and they said that white workers just followed what the straw bosses and bosses said, like, you go here and they go there, and there was just really no intermingling. Whereas my friend said by the time her uncle was working in it, there were a lot of Eastern European immigrants, as well as a dwindling number of white American-born workers, and there was no real segregation anymore. They intermingled at lunch and in the fields, and so I really had hoped to make this part of it, but unfortunately my friend had a serious family crisis, and so we couldn't end up pursuing this. But I did want to say that it was interesting to talk. I come from Quebecois family, so this relates to something Fiona said too, that those Quebecois people are in there, they are part of this, and coming out of these poor working class neighborhoods. Like Meriden was a really industrialized city, and that he was coming from. So that's just a little interlude of time before my return to the Needleworkers, and that their continued organizing. And these are examples that come from my larger project of Puerto Rican needleworkers and organizing. But as I said, farm worker organizing was really different. Oh, I'm running out of time. Farm worker organizing was really different. It really picks up in the 70s. By this time, deindustrialization in New England cities is starting to impact the urban neighborhoods. But in these rural areas, the Farm Workers Council forms, and it really gets a big boost in 74 when Cesar Chavez comes with the United Farm Workers and visits. But again, they're not part of an actual union effort to get NLRB certification in any successful way, which actually allows them to become a massive part of this, what we would call today like the nonprofit industrial complex of just these large organizations that actually funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes even millions into urban areas. So you have a organization that started as a rural farm workers organization that now it still serves farm workers, it still serves migrating farm workers, it still has ESL classes and job transition classes, and help to get farm workers at the end of the season into some type of job training if they have green cards or citizenship, or how to help them. But they're also extremely active in the Work Investment Act, the WWII Act, which is a federal program to get money into workforce development. It's a business-minded project. It's not a labor-minded project. And that's what I think is interesting, is that, you know, NEFWIC's ability to kind of shift to workforce development rather than labor organizing actually allowed it to become a successful organization serving low-income people. So I don't know what that says to labor organizers. It's not meant to be pessimistic, but just, I guess, realistic about where the more successful worker efforts have gone. As you can see here, it's still a bilingual organization. It has major offices in Springfield, Holyoke, and Chicopee. It serves low-income people from all over Western and Connecticut and Western Massachusetts. They do offer, this is specifically what they offer to farm workers. So they still have a mission to serve farm workers. But that previous list is kind of their broader services, which I think reach, you know, hundreds of thousands of more people across the 3 states. When I worked in the nonprofits, people would be like, you go to NEFWIC to get your fuel subsidy vouchers. You go to NEFWIC to get your childcare vouchers for your GED program, or you go to NEFWIC to get something to pay for your GED test fees. So they were very heavily involved in adult basic education and low-income services and job training, as well as farm workers. On the bottom right here, you see Heriberto Flores, and he's been the CEO of NEFWIC for many years. You can see there he's with Deval Patrick, the governor of Massachusetts. I don't think any Puerto Rican needleworker ILGW rep ever got a meeting with the governor of Massachusetts. But this is again, its ability to take what had been farm worker training and support into workforce development, into what's become also a major real estate development agency in Springfield. It's bought up properties in Springfield as well. This, and I'm running over time, so I'll just say Via Taino is a public housing where my friend's uncle used to stay in the tobacco housing. So tobacco housing used to be here at this site in the North End in Springfield. and eventually became public housing, which eventually became named Via Taino in honor of the fact, I don't think anyone knows this. If you ask anybody in Springfield, I don't think anyone knows this, but that it was originally housing for Puerto Rican tobacco workers brought by the companies. Then this is part of a larger chapter where I talk about the fact that Puerto Rican industrial workers, women Puerto Rican industrial workers, instead get absorbed into the narrative of the welfare queen. So they not only vanish, but they become part of this narrative of women of color or migrating women who just come to the cities in order to take welfare benefits. But I will end, this is my final slide that I want to make people connect back to the first slide, that these are Puerto Rican women workers today, that they're still in unions, they're still activists. In the upper left, you see United Electrical Worker women union members who the UE paid for them to go down to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria to help build housing and to try to deal with the crisis there. So unions are still full of Puerto Rican women, and there's still Puerto Rican women labor activists, and to try to reinsert them, replace them into the narrative of Puerto Rican women, but also US labor history. Sorry, I went over time. Thank you.
All right. Alicia and Kristen.
Okay, good afternoon. Well, it's still morning. Thank you. Thank you everybody for staying and being here. Our presentation is going to be a little different than what you've been hearing, maybe a little bit of application. Oh, we're sharing our screen. A little application of tobacco research into a public performance. My name's Alicia Bright Holland, and welcome to this virtual presentation of Cultivating Dignity. I am a choreographer and physical theater deviser and assistant professor of theater specializing in dance and world performance at Eastern Connecticut State University, along with...
I am Kristen Morgan. I'm a theater and new media studies professor at Eastern as well. And then we have one of our students here as well.
I'm Drew, I'm a senior at Eastern here, and I worked on a little bit of a film based around this that'll be later in the presentation.
Okay. So in this presentation, we'll be discussing the production of an experimental film entitled Cultivating Dignity, the same as our presentation, as well as a companion documentary that Drew just spoke of, Stepping into the Shade. Cultivating Dignity, like our 2017 production of Thread City, was created by working with community partners and using a pedagogical framework of in-class, ensemble training, field research, independent studies, and performance practicums. This production was originally conceived as a stage play based on research of Dr. Martin Luther King's time spent working at the Coleman Brothers farm in Simsbury in the 1940s. However, due to COVID, Cultivating Dignity has been reimagined as an experimental film, which will premiere in a week from today's time. And our work together will continue into the next academic year to include a high school educational theater unit, collaborative installations, as well as digital archives.
So our work with students and community partners here at Eastern is based on theory and practice of three main types of theater, which are American documentary, community-based, and devised. As Jules Odendahl James noted in an American Theater article on the history of US documentary theater, a twofold insistence on questioning and shaping reality gives documentary theater its unique character, whether one prioritizes its content or its form. First, by dramatizing lesser known or counter-narrative aspects of contested or supposedly stable experiences, documentary theater unsettles what we thought we knew in an effort to upend privilege, invert the margin and the center, and interrogate structures of authority. Second, theater offers a unique opportunity for a body-to-body experience in a shared material space, which makes it a complicated and dangerous art, no matter its form. So these tenets describe our pedagogical approach to developing theater that is deeply engaged with local communities and gives voice to marginalized people and their stories.
Community partners. They're important stakeholders in our devising work. We work throughout our university's Center for Community Engagement on campus, as well as building relationships forged during previous devising projects. Community voices are deeply embedded in our process. In addition to collaborating closely with the center's director, Kim Silcox, other Eastern partners include Dr. Stacy Close, our Vice President of Equity and Diversity, who is a champion of our projects and provides research guidance as well as generous financial support. Dr. Barbara Tucker, the Director of Eastern Center for Connecticut Studies, which is housed in the on-campus library, inspires curiosity about local history. We collaborate with other faculty and staff across the university who share research, best practices, and support our work in many other ways. Our students also cultivate relationships with individuals and organizations, including local public schools, social services, museums, religious communities, and institutions like the NAACP Wyndham Chapter and Moral Mondays, Connecticut out of Hartford.
So the way we start our projects is with what Tectonic Theater Project calls the hunch, or the initial idea that hooks us into the story. And then we prepare for our devising process. And that can mean parsing through oral history transcripts and recordings, as well as looking at ephemera from the time period under investigation, and then often visiting the places where salient events took place. But most importantly, we meet with stakeholders to find out how they would like to tell their stories through our work. And these are just a couple pages of photographs from some of our previous projects. So this was Thread City. Alicia and I collaborated on this in 2017. And this play centered around stories of the workers at the American Thread Company mill in Willimantic. And then this project was called Africa to America. Alicia and I collaborated on this with our colleague, Dr. Duran Williams. And this was a play that followed the journey of African Americans from Africa to present day.
The hunch. So the initial idea for cultivating dignity came from a lecture given by Dr. Stacy Close at Eastern in 2016. Dr. Close, as I said before, is our Vice President of Equity and Diversity, as well as an accomplished history professor specializing in the study of the Great Migration. Dr. Close discussed the tobacco industry in Connecticut and mentioned, almost as an aside, that Dr. King had worked right here in Connecticut in the summers while he was a college student at Morehouse College in Atlanta. This kernel of information immediately captured our curiosity, and we promised to come back to it later as a point of exploration for further work. After speaking further with Dr. Close and doing a bit of cursorial research on the subject, we realized that the time a young Dr. King spent in Connecticut had a tremendous influence on his later work as a civil rights leader. Working with award-winning local playwright Darcy Bruce, we developed a script. The title, Cultivating Dignity, references both the agricultural practice of growing tobacco as well as Dr. King's activism in the labor movement, and his assertion that no work is insignificant. All labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence.
So after 3 years of research, conducting interviews, devising in classes, and then workshopping the script, we were finally ready to kick off the production in March. And the rehearsal period for Cultivating Dignity started with a 3-day virtual residency with the UK-based theater company Frantic Assembly. Frantic Assembly is known for their devised work infused with physical theater and for their Ignition program, which engages at-risk youth in England through performance. Our devising process also pulls from methodology of other influential practitioners like Augusto Boal and Tectonic Theater Project. These practices infuse our pedagogy in which we immerse students in the devising process across all levels of experience. We work with students in STEPCAP, which is Eastern's transitional conditional admittance program, which occurs in the summer session, as well as through upper level courses in experimental theater and the African American Performance Lab. So students in these classes are pivotal stakeholders, as much of what we develop with them is then used in the final script and or performances. Often there's a more formal audition and rehearsal process in the months leading up to public performances of the work in order to bring some fresh voices into the fold. And then community members may also participate in the rehearsal process as well, either through onstage roles or through solicitation of feedback for work in progress. So now I'm gonna turn things over to our student Drew, and he can introduce a little bit of his film. So right now we're producing the experimental film Cultivating Dignity. Today's our last day of filming on location at Holiday Hill in Mansfield. And Drew is working alongside of us to create kind of a companion documentary on some related subjects. So whenever you're ready, Drew.
Everybody, this is kind of a presentation of what I've been researching this semester. I definitely want to improve on this documentary and include more information and more interviews and everything, but this is a really cool presentation of what I've been researching. So I hope you all enjoy.
The year 1944 was the year Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would set foot in Simsbury, Connecticut for the first time. Pivotal period.
No, it's okay.
His life that helped shape his perspective of the world around him. King was one of thousands of Southern African American students to make the trek north for summer work in the 1940s.
As we know, the tobacco fields they employed college students from the South, and they created a contract with Morehouse College, a prestigious HBCU that has graduated all sorts of phenomenal folks, including first Black Mayor of Atlanta, in addition to Dr. King, Sam Jackson, actually Senator right now, Raphael Warnock, who is a senior pastor of King's Church. He's a Morehouse alum as well. I know all these people because I'm a Morehouse alum, and any Morehouse man will tell you in the first 5 minutes that they will find some kind of way to work in Morehouse. So I'm very, very proud of my alma mater, but King was part of a number of students at Morehouse College who spent their summers in Simsbury and earning money for school. He was very young and came in during the World War II. Some schools had early admission because so many people were fighting and so many young men were in war and drafted. So King was part of this group of very young teenagers who were able to enter college early. And so he got a chance to spend 2 summers in Simsbury.
Yeah, my aunt came up from, well, my family members, not my mother, because my mother was a little bit younger at that time, but her older sister and her older cousins came up here to work in summers. They worked in Summers, he worked in Simsbury, but they're all right there together anyway. Well, not really, because Simsbury's down there. Anyway, the thing is that my aunt is now like 80 something. So her memory wasn't too sharp, but what she said was she remembered coming up here like on a Trailways bus from Charlottesville, Virginia, which is where my family's from, and going to work at these farms. And she said they stayed in these little houses and people treated them well, but that they worked a lot of hours. I don't think she remembered much more than that. So, and it's funny because like growing up, we never talked about that. I don't even know how I found out. At some point, somebody said, oh, well, that's how they all came up here, is because they went to work at those farms out in Amherst, right? But I don't ever recall it being like part of the family conversation. A lot of our family history was never discussed with us. Nobody ever talked about my aunt and my mom's two cousins, quote unquote, migrating to Connecticut for a better life. It just was, and so when I brought it up to my aunt that I had these college students that wanted to interview her, she said, wow, Lee, I haven't thought about that or talked about that in many, many, many years.
Recruiters hired students from one of the country's top black colleges to harvest shade tobacco, one of the state's biggest cash crops.
Tobacco has always been grown in Connecticut, all the way back to colonial times. There was a law passed by the Connecticut legislature that said any tobacco products sold or used in Connecticut had to be grown in Connecticut. In the early 1900s, an experiment took place where they decided that they were going to try to grow the tobacco under netting. And they put up their poles and they connected the poles with wooden boards and then had the netting on top of those boards. And they discovered that it created a much thinner leaf. And a thinner leaf was ideal for the outer wrapper of a cigar. I'm told it doesn't do much for the taste, doesn't have any real effect on the taste of the cigar. That's all the ground up materials, ground up tobacco that they put in the center. Tobacco likes a sandy soil, and there is actually a defined Windsor soil.
On Sundays, King and the other students would go to the First Church of Christ to attend a service. In letters home, King talked about working hard on the Coleman Brothers farm. He also talked about eating at nice restaurants and going to church with white people. Morehouse students attended integrated dances at the Simsbury Grange.
King got a chance to go to Hartford and travel from Simsbury to Hartford. This would be in Simsbury and go to church and see white and black parishioners in the same church, which is something we did not see at home in Atlanta. And to also go downtown and be able to go inside of a restaurant or a movie theater and not be denied entry in ways that he had been in downtown Atlanta. And it seems quite crude, coarse, and offensive and immoral and ethical. I tell my students to just imagine going to a Starbucks and just can't get in, because they serve one race. They actually explicitly base themselves on this principle that we do not believe in fairness. And we will just deny you access to this Burger King or the movie theater. And that world was a world that he lived in. So seeing that and the ease with which people were able to occupy the same space will demonstrate to him that these things, as a child, the very limited worldview, just seeing what was in front of him, he got a chance to see things very differently, and it disrupted so much what his world had been up to that point.
In 1944, he wrote to his parents, to his father, and said, "You won't believe what's happening here." On our way here, we got to see some things that I had never anticipated. After we passed DC, there was no discrimination. We were able to go anywhere we want and sit anywhere we want. And white people were nice to us. So as a young black man coming from a segregated South, that's quite the awareness moment for him in his life.
Many of these men had trouble adjusting to the difference between life in Connecticut and life in Mississippi, let's say. I had two men, this was April vacation from school, and I was working at the farm, and I'd gone to Southbury to pick up a load of cedar poles. And we're going to use the poles to split the fields in half to make them shorter, make it easier for the picking crew. I came back with the poles. My brother-in-law gave me two helpers, both from Mississippi. They climbed on the back of the truck, and they dumped poles off every 33 feet where they were going to split the field. When we finished that, my instructions were take your two helpers, go down, empty the truck, and load up bales of wire. Well, the bales of wire were considerably heavy. And I always did it with two people on a bale of wire. Well, these two men started just throwing the bales onto the truck. And every time I reached for a bale, one of them would take it and grab it and throw it on the truck. Got the wire loaded up, it starts to rain. I suggested to them, come on, get in the cab of the truck with me. They would not get into the cab. It took those men the better part of a month to adjust to the fact that they were no longer in Mississippi. And it was eye-opening for me. I heard about the treatment of blacks down south and that type of thing, but it was just, almost like a rumor. But to watch the way they tiptoed for the first 3 or 4 weeks was eye-opening, to say the least. They really didn't know how to behave in Connecticut. They thought Connecticut was just like Mississippi, and they had to follow these particular rules that they had grown up with.
So yeah, that was stepping into the shade.
Is that the conclusion, Lisha?
That's it. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Oh, thank you guys. Thank you for presentations that do a really great job of connecting the local and regional to the global, and for showing the really generative, the really generative entry points, I think, for talking about the social, economic, and political relationships that that undergirds U.S. history, right? And the legacies that we're still seeing in all of the spaces that we're occupying, whether that's in Summers or in Deerfield or in Willimantic or in Hartford or Simsbury. I found this panel really useful for doing some reflection on sort of what Jason was talking about, the configurations of global capital. We're ready for questions. So
I just wanted to also let folks know that I put the link in the chat. This is the link to the experimental film that it's supposed to come out on May 1st. So it's free. You just sign up to register so that you can get the link to watch the film. So.
Is it premiering at a particular time with like a group audience, or?
No, we're not having an audience. No, we won't have like a public viewing or anything. It's just watch on your own, anytime on your own. It's probably after 7 on that day, but I'll have to double check.
Sandy, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what I'm thinking about, you said that you had to sort of go back to Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. And I wonder if you think that framing is also appropriate now and not just in the context of Turner's thesis.
That's an interesting question. Thank you. I think it is appropriate now, so I'll have to speak kind of particularly to, so I'm Filipino American and I'm a professor of Spanish and Latinx studies, kind of trained in Americanness, right? And so I think there's a lot of that kind of shuffling. I think you could see it in my presentation. There's a lot of shuffling around and making these connections, and also in a weird way, like, not like Turner, but kind of being conscripted into these weird kind of moments of racial drag where people view me in a particular way, and speaking Spanish doesn't help. But then there's also real connectivity there because the Philippines was also a Spanish colony. It's also Hispanic in many ways, but it's not a Spanophone. And so it's like this, I think it's appropriate to kind of go back to the extent that there are these shared colonial histories in which that overlap populations that under US sort of racial imaginary we would imagine as discrete. Asian Americans here, Latinx Americans here, different histories of migration, different relationships to the racial state. One's a model minority, one is, not a problematic minority, right? But there are kind of affinities and connectivities in the present that are enabled because of those traumatic histories in a weird way. So there's like a interesting, so it's appropriate to the extent that there's a kind of possible reparative read there that, so like in the classroom, while I am different from my Latinx heritage students, for instance, there is like meaningful connection that's possible. So that's one thing that occurs to me in approaching an answer to your question.
Alicia and Kristen, I was wondering, why do you think it's taken so long to unearth this episode? Right, I've been hearing for a really long time, like ever since I moved to Connecticut, I've been hearing about Dr. King's time here, but haven't quite seen anything kind of coalesce or I mean, take advantage.
Oh, I know at one point that Simsbury Church was trying to erect a monument of Dr. King and like wanted to kind of have ownership of his time here. And that there was controversy around that monument.
We were voting last week.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a vote about erecting a monument.
Do you know the outcome?
I haven't checked to see if it went through.
Drew has an interview that wasn't in that film with Bishop John Selders, and he had talked to Alicia and I about that story a long time ago, and then I think Drew got an interview with him where he talks some more about Simsbury Church, as Alicia said, wanting to claim ownership.
Yeah, he was talking about that.
Yeah,
that's going to be a really interesting part to put in there later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting because it's like, and then the I know the dormitory, the men's dormitory was like burnt down in a fire exercise, like a firefighter exercise in the 80s. So it's like, why did the history kind of like get lost there? Yeah. And I have been working on a kind of a separate documentary thing that's close to this that goes over that, because I was like fascinated by that. Like, why was that gone for so long? So that's another thing that I'm working on right now, actually.
I don't know the answer, Fiona.
It seems like a missed opportunity, especially it's painful to watch the video of, it's not like an accidental fire. They like set it on fire.
Right.
Boy, somebody really missed the memo.
Right. I know even now in Simsbury, there's something going on with there's a referendum coming up on the 4th to vote on whether to to have the town buy the remaining barns that are left, and turn it into, they might have a museum dedicated to Dr. King's time here and some other things. But I think it was sold to developers who were going to turn it into housing, and now it's up for referendum. So maybe in the future it'll be highlighted more. You know, we hope with this project. I had never heard of it before. I'm from Virginia. So I don't know, you know, what I know about Connecticut history is not, wasn't learned like throughout school, but I was surprised when Dr. Close even told us about it because I had never heard of it before.
Elena?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was so interested in this, in everybody's talk, but I took a class last semester where it was like theater for social change, and it was because it was a Latinx studies class, and it was like the only one offered at the university, and I was like, I'm gonna take this undergrad class, and it really changed the way that I thought about historical processes and just the way that I did research, right? And we ended up doing a play on on campus policing, because we have a big, we're talking about getting rid of the campus police. It's been an issue at Michigan. And I was just, I just wanted to say, it's more of a comment, but I just wanted to say, I feel like you all have a lot of the main players, right? Dr. Close, Dr. Ogbar, these are exactly the people that, you know, I'm in conversation with when I think about how my work, how Puerto Ricans, you know, become part of this society in the 60s and 70s. And so I think one thing that this, you know, the video made me think of is that I think we need to maybe, you know, reach out and more and think about more broadly the way we think about the tobacco networks, because I've talked to like Jeffrey Ogbar and like, you know, about specifically about like Hartford, but I think a lot of us have a very select view of one area. And I think that what that video shows us is that the processes are happening all over the state. And so even though it's not Summers, it's Suffield, it's, you know, what that woman was kind of describing is really key. And that's something that I hint at, because there's not I can't really fully trace like direct lineages in some cases. So I have to think about this space as the greater Hartford space, right? And that opens up Windsor and that opens up Simsbury to those conversations. So it's more of just thanking you. And I would love to talk to you all more, because part of my dissertation is going to be documentary work. And so, yeah, so definitely be in contact with y'all.
Jason, you're muted.
There we go. Yeah, Elena, that idea sounds amazing. And, you know, maybe that could be some, you know, culmination of part 2. Could do something collaboratively along these lines with your dissertation work and our amazing theater professors. So yeah, that's really exciting, and you know, maybe we should make that an agenda item for our next meeting. But you know, so for me, there's kind of a through line between these papers that has, you know, kind of struck me in a profound way, because Sony, your presentation made me think about the ways that Connecticut, the growers in Connecticut defined themselves in a way that was that settlement had been completed, right? But yet there was always this kind of effort to recreate a colonial condition despite the sort of closure, right? There's no more immigrants, but migrant laborers, right, are required as a part of that, and that kind of like imagination about what development would look like in Connecticut, it really, you know, kind of came into focus for me when you talked about prosthetic labor. And that this, something that could be like attached and detached, that could be a part of it, necessary for high functioning, but could be detached and dismembered, that was also apparent in Amy's presentation about the dynamics of labor organizing in these different fields, from needlework versus tobacco work. And there seemed to be, perhaps it is the seasonability, the flexibility demanded of tobacco workers, even though it's situated in a place that prevented them from having a kind of a more, I guess, what is it? Monopoly or power of labor to demand conditions from the growers, and that maybe that type of organization that they created, the New England Farm Worker Council, is a reflection of these longer, kind of historical bottlenecks that just, where there's a demand, and the growers meet that demand in like a myriad number of ways that differ from season to season, right? Like I found growers went to Boston to recruit Chinese workers during from Boston's Chinatown during a period where they needed more workers, and then it never happened again, right? So there was like, I think maybe those conditions really set up, anyways, that was something that I felt like could help me to understand better, the ways that organizing has to deal with different kinds of problems. And then finally with the cultivating dignity, it made me think of the ways that tobacco in Connecticut is always kind of performing. It's always performing a certain, kind of presence in the state, and that there's a way that the capitalist structure of the industry is kind of clothed in a fiction about what the story is, and how it makes sense here, why people come and go, and that in part the politics around tobacco is about shaping those stories about why tobacco is here or why those workers are here. And so it made me really kind of think about those connections as reflections of white supremacy, and how those that deeper structure has this kind of mundane presence, and is structures the culture and the modes of production, and I just found the presentations really stimulating altogether. So thank you, everyone. This is really terrific.
Doug has put in the chat about Connecticut being in the tobacco industry being in decline for decades, and that most of the historical interest has been in preserving the sheds rather than the people, and how there's a ton of books on sheds in the bookstore, but none on the people in the community. And in terms of echoing what Jason's just saying about what Connecticut's self-image of this industry is, and what it is that what is it that they're performing. I don't know, and it would be great if we should try to have some kind of viewing of this parish film, and the focus on that, and also the Shade Tobacco Growers propaganda film, Alicia.
I just made me think the last time we were at the Connecticut Tobacco Museum, they were telling us they're doing a retrospective or something about that Parrish movie. And so this summer, and they're interviewing all the original folks that were a part of it. So I wonder if any of them are here at our presentation, and if it will reshape maybe how they might think about retelling that. I also haven't seen the film.
Okay. Elena?
I just wanted to add something that came after what Jason said, and also just made me think about why the work, I guess, that we're doing is so important. I think the other big thing is that when we think about tobacco in Connecticut, it often gets cast as a very white working class, or it gets cast as a thing like everybody did it, like local people, everyone did it, depending on what age range you're talking to. And so it's often like people are not understanding that the way that people are getting racialized as they come, because and I talked a little bit, I've spoken to people about this a little bit, but just the differences in hours that like Simsbury residents would, like white, 16-year-olds would have different hours than West Indian workers, like some of those differences. And so it really tied me to Sunny's point, which was that like race is a product of labor. And I was just like, I just had to get that out there, because I think we're all kind of talking about that. But I think that's what makes this work so critical and different, is that we're adding that to this. I mean, it's kind of interesting because we're talking about shade collective, but we're adding color, we're adding shade to tobacco in a lot of ways in which people don't think about it in that way. So I just thought that was like really powerful for me. So thank you for putting the language to that work, Sunny.
Jason and I just wanted to take 5 minutes to close and say, to say what some of our next steps are, which is obviously to continue to build out this collective. It would be really great to have some presentations on the Quebecois folks who are invisible. I haven't seen much. There is at the moment where I'm working on with NPR, WNPR, CPB, Connecticut Public Broadcasting, and Hartford Stage on radio plays around the experience of different communities in the greater Hartford region, and tobacco has come up as a really important part of that. So stay tuned. We're trying to figure out which CPB programming we're going to invade to who has airtime in their programming to air our radio play, but we envision doing a number of these over the next few years. And I think it's really important for us to think about the additional silences and invisibility, like which communities that are now working and have succeeded or are working alongside West Indians and Puerto Ricans, what are we doing to capture their stories? And so Jason and I have talked about possibly doing an oral history project. Finally, there is a mapping project that is going to map the movement of African Americans between 1840 and 1940 to sort of show both the transience of the population as people use Connecticut as a gateway state to head out to other places, but also for those who chose to stay, the way that they're enclosed and surveyed in the city of Hartford. And that's the 1900 version of that map is on the Hartford Bound website, so hartfordbound.com. So you can check out the maps and look at the dot density animation. You can literally see the African-American population sort of moving from where the railroad and the Connecticut River across the Northeast, across Keeney Park until they land in the Blue Hills, neighborhood. And then the tremendous possibility of curriculum. I know that there's going to be a curriculum component to this, and it's really apropos and timely given the African American and Puerto Rican history initiatives. And I think the work that we've been, doing for the last year and a half, like we're not just coming to this, we've given a lot of thought. Cultivating Dignity, has had a lot of time to marinate and to generate its product. So I'm really looking forward, if we can get all of this into the school system, into the K-12 school system, and the next generation of folks who fashion themselves as community organizers and activists and future scholars can be informed by this and are exposed to everyone from West Indians, Puerto Ricans, African Americans, Guatemalans, Laotians, everyone who has made tobacco successful in this state. I think we would have done a tremendous service. Jason, want to sign us off?
Fiona, I couldn't have said it any better. It's such a pleasure to work with you. This is the first step.
And it's fun. Don't forget, it's fun. It's all been great fun.
It has. It has. And so I do look forward to a potential post-COVID in-person hangout where we can share our work and share space and continue this this conversation. So again, we really think that this has enormous potential to support other work. So if there are other people who aren't here, who should be here, invite them. And we want to. This is an open door policy, and I think we're all strengthened by the work that is present. So so with that, I want to encourage everyone to marinate in these panels and then get outside and enjoy at least here it's sunny, but yeah, it's so lovely to see everyone. Thank you for the attendees for coming in and staying indoors on beautiful Saturday. And I think, Fiona, you have another note?
Oh, just sorry guys, on May 22nd, we have our youth art competition.
Thank you.
So we're going to ask the members of the Shade Collective to be our judges. We have high school students who are going to be submitting their creative pieces, and those are going to come in on May 1st. But we figured after post grades, we will have a shorter youth event where we announce the winners and look at a gallery of their work. I forgot to say that.
Awesome. And we'll keep things updated on the website. You have other updates from your research, anything else. This is a platform to lift up your work. So do keep in touch.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Until next time.
Oops. Bye, Jason.